Hey there and welcome back. If the day behind you has worn you down to the quiet hours, and you are ready now to set it aside and let your thoughts travel somewhere far away into another country and another century altogether, then you have come to just the right place tonight. This is an hour for slow breathing and a darkened room and the soft gold of a single lamp, and it is for you, whoever you are, and wherever you happen to be lying as you listen. Tonight I want to take you to France, to the last bright decades before the revolution swept the old world away, and to tell you the story of one woman who rose from almost nothing to the very summit of that gilded world, and then fell further than almost anyone has ever fallen. She was born the illegitimate daughter of a seamstress in a small town in the east of France, a child of no name and no fortune, and she ended her days as the last great love of a king, mistress of the most magnificent court in Europe, dressed in diamonds and lodged in a palace above the river. And then, when the revolution came, she ended her days a second time, on a scaffold in a Paris square, weeping and pleading for a few more minutes of life. Her name was Jeanne, and the world would come to know her as the Comtesse du Barry. By the end of this evening you will have followed her all the way from a convent schoolroom to the apartments of Versailles, and from there to the very edge of the blade. And you will understand, I hope, why her story has haunted people for more than 200 years. Before we begin that journey, let me say a quiet word to you, the one listening now, because it matters to me who is travelling along on a night like this. If you find that these long, unhurried evenings of history are a good way to loosen the grip of the day and drift gently towards sleep, then you are very welcome to subscribe and to come wandering through the past with me again on other nights. And I would love to know where in the world you are listening from this evening, and what the hour happens to be where you are, whether it is the deep middle of the night beyond your curtains, or only the first soft dimming of the afternoon. I look through the little notes that folk leave far more often than you might imagine, and there is something steadying in the thought of so many of us, scattered across so many countries and so many separate lives, gathered together for a while inside the same old story. So settle yourself however you are most comfortable. Let your shoulders come down and your breathing slow, and let us go together into the France of long ago. Picture this. A morning in the early autumn of the year 1769, and the long galleries of the Palace of Versailles are filling with people. The courtiers are gathering, hundreds of them, in their silks and their powder and their jewels, pressing into the great rooms that look out over the gardens, and there is a strange excitement in the air, a current of malice and curiosity running through the crowd, because today something is going to happen that half of them have sworn could never be allowed. Today a woman is to be presented to the king and to the court, formally received into the highest society in the land, and that woman was, until a year or two ago, entirely unknown, a creature of the Paris streets and the fashion shops, a beauty with no birth and no breeding, and a past that the whole court has been whispering about for months. The old duchesses are appalled. The princes are uneasy. And somewhere behind a closed door, a young woman of extraordinary loveliness is being laced into a gown sewn with diamonds, trembling a little, waiting to walk out into that sea of hostile faces and make the deep, sweeping curtsy that will change her life forever. That is where we are going tonight. So let us go back to the beginning and find out how she came to be standing behind that door. To understand the strange and dazzling rise of Jeanne Becu, you have to understand the country she was born into, for the France of the middle of the 18th century was one of the most rigidly ordered societies the world has ever known, a world where a person's whole destiny was fixed, almost from birth, by the rank into which they came. At the summit sat the king, an absolute monarch who ruled by the grace of God and answered to no parliament and no people. Beneath him spread the great nobility, the dukes and the marquises and the ancient families whose blood ran back for centuries, who held the high offices and the great estates and lived in a splendour that the rest of the nation could scarcely imagine. And below them, far below, lived the vast mass of the French nation, the merchants and the craftsmen, and above all the peasants who worked the land, millions upon millions of them, paying the taxes that supported the entire glittering edifice above their heads. The distance between the top and the bottom of this society was immense, and it was meant to be uncrossable. A child born to a labourer or a servant was expected to remain a labourer or a servant, and a child born to a duke was born to a life of privilege and command. The accident of birth decided everything, and the idea that a person might rise from the very bottom to the very top, from a seamstress's cottage to the bedchamber of Louis, was so far outside the natural order of things as to seem almost an offence against nature itself. This is what made the story of Jeanne Becu so scandalous to the people who lived through it, and so fascinating to everyone since, for she did precisely the thing that was not supposed to be possible. She crossed the whole vast distance, from the lowest rank to the highest, and she did it on nothing but the strength of her beauty and her charm. At the heart of this ordered world stood Versailles, the colossal palace that the old King Louis XIV had built outside Paris, and that had become the centre of the entire French universe. To Versailles came the great nobles, drawn from their estates to dance attendance upon the king, for it was here in these gilded galleries that power and favour and fortune were dispensed. The whole life of the court revolved around the person of the monarch, around his rising in the morning and his retiring at night, around the chance of a word from him or a glance of his eye, and the nobility competed without cease for his attention, for a position near his person was the surest road to wealth and influence. Versailles was a stage, a theatre of rank and ceremony, where every gesture was watched and every position was fought over, and to win a place at its centre was the highest ambition a French heart could hold. Thousands lived within its walls and its dependencies, a whole city of nobles and servants and hangers-on, and the daily round of the court ran to a clockwork of ceremony from the king's waking to his sleeping. To be lodged there, even in some cramped attic room beneath the leads, was a privilege men schemed for years to obtain, for nearness to the king was the one currency that mattered, and the whole vast machine existed to bring the favoured few within reach of the royal glance. And at the very centre of that centre, beside the monarch himself, stood a figure of peculiar and particular power, the royal mistress. For the kings of France did not love only their queens, and the woman who held the heart of the monarch, the maîtresse en titre or official mistress, occupied a position of extraordinary influence, courted and flattered and feared, able to make and unmake the fortunes of those around her. The great Madame de Pompadour had held that place for 20 years, a woman of taste and intelligence who had ruled the king's affections and meddled in the affairs of the kingdom, and when she died, there was a void beside the ageing Louis, an empty place at the heart of Versailles that someone, sooner or later, would fill. It was into that void, against all the laws of rank and all the expectations of the age, that a beautiful young woman from the bottom of society would one day step. But that lay far in the future. First, she had to be born. And she was born in the most obscure circumstances imaginable, in a small town far from the splendour of the palace. She was born on the 19th of August in the year 1743 in the little town of Vaucouleurs in the region of Lorraine, in the east of France, and she came into the world with every disadvantage that the age could heap upon a child. She was illegitimate, the daughter of a seamstress named Jeanne Becu, an unmarried woman who sewed and laboured to keep herself, and the identity of the girl's father was never certain, though it was widely believed to be a friar attached to the town, a man of the church who had strayed from his vows. To be born outside marriage in that age was a heavy thing, a stain that clung to a child through life, and to be born outside marriage and poor besides was to begin existence at the very bottom of the heap, with nothing and no one to smooth the way. The child was christened Jeanne, and from her earliest years she knew the precariousness of a life lived without money or protection. Her mother struggled to provide, moving in search of work and support, depending upon the charity of others, and the little family lived always on the edge, where a turn of bad fortune could mean real want. Yet into this hard and uncertain world, the child brought one gift that would in time change everything, for Jeanne Becu was, even as a small girl, remarkably beautiful. She had a sweetness of face and a grace of manner that drew the eye and softened the heart, and as she grew it became plain that here was a loveliness out of the ordinary run, the kind of beauty that opens doors which birth and money keep shut. A measure of help came at last from a man named Monsieur de Monceau, a financier who took an interest in Anne Becu and her daughter, and lent the family a degree of support and protection. Through his kindness, or his patronage, the mother found a more settled situation, and the child was given something that a girl of her origins could rarely hope for, a chance at an education. It was a small thing in itself, the charity of a well-disposed man toward a struggling woman and her pretty daughter, but it lifted Jeanne, just a little, out of the very lowest depths, and it set her on a path that would carry her, by slow degrees, toward the glittering world she was eventually to conquer. It was through such connections, it was said, that the door of a Paris convent was open to her, a small kindness that altered the whole course of the girl's life. Without that early helping hand, the seamstress's daughter might have vanished into the obscurity from which she came, and the world would never have known her name. So the child of no name began her existence in poverty and uncertainty, marked by the circumstances of her birth, dependent upon the kindness of strangers, possessed of nothing in the world but a face of uncommon beauty, and a temperament, by all accounts, of uncommon sweetness. She was not clever in the bookish way, and she would never be a woman of learning or of deep cultivation. But she had something that learning cannot give, a natural grace and warmth, an ease and a gaiety that drew folk toward her, and this, far more than any accomplishment of the mind, was the gift that would carry her upward. The next step on that upward road was the convent, where the daughter of the seamstress was sent to be schooled by the nuns, and it is there that we shall follow her next. When Jeanne was still a young girl, she was placed in a convent in Paris, the house of Saint-Ours, where the nuns took in girls of modest birth and gave them a schooling suited to their station. It was, for a child of her origins, a stroke of real good fortune, for the convent offered safety and order, and a degree of education, the chance to learn to read and write, and sew and carry herself with some refinement, and to spend her most impressionable years within walls that sheltered her from the harder dangers of the Paris streets. For something like 9 years, the daughter of the seamstress lived among the nuns, growing from a child into a young woman within the quiet routine of the cloister. The education she received there was not the learning of a great lady, for the nuns of Saint-Ours trained their charges for useful and modest lives, in needlework and the domestic arts and the gentler accomplishments, in the manners and the piety thought proper for girls who would have to make their own way in society. Jeanne learned to sew with skill, to dress hair, to move and speak with a grace beyond her birth, and she absorbed, almost without knowing it, a polish and a charm that would later astonish the courtiers of Versailles, who could not believe that so much elegance had come out of so humble a beginning. The convent gave her, in its quiet way, the foundation of the manner that would one day carry her into the company of kings, but it was within those same sheltering walls that the true temperament of her gift first began to show itself in earnest. For as Jeanne grew toward womanhood, her beauty bloomed into something extraordinary. She was fair, with a mass of golden hair and a complexion of roses and cream, with wide blue eyes and a soft, sweet, slightly drowsy loveliness that people who saw her in her prime would struggle to describe. So far did it exceed the ordinary. There was nothing sharp or cold in her looks, no hauteur, but a warmth and a gentleness that made her the more enchanting, and even as a girl she had the quality that would mark her all her time, the power to make those who beheld her wish to please her and protect her. It was a dangerous gift for a poor girl with no family to guard her, and the convent could shelter her only so long. In time the schooling came to an end, as it had to, and Jeanne went out from the quiet of the cloister into the noise and the danger of Paris, a beautiful young woman of humble birth, with no fortune, no powerful family, and nothing to live on but the work of her own hands and the loveliness of her own face. The world she stepped into was the most brilliant and the most pitiless city in Europe, a place of dazzling wealth and grinding poverty pressed close together, where a girl such as she might rise or might be destroyed, and where her face would be at once her greatest asset and her greatest peril. She had to find work, and she had to find protection, and the search for both would draw her, step by step, into the world that would make her name. Let us follow her then, out of the convent and into the streets of Paris. The Paris into which Jeanne Becu emerged was a city of more than 500,000 folk, the largest and most brilliant capital on the continent, a place of magnificent townhouses and squalid alleys, of churches and theatres and shops crammed together along narrow, crowded, often filthy streets. For a girl with nothing but her hands and her looks, it was a place of both opportunity and peril, where work could be found, but where a girl without protection lived always on the edge of disaster. Jeanne took the obvious path for a girl of her training, the path of the needle and the trade in fashion, and she found employment as an assistant in the world of dress and adornment that served the rich women of the city. For a time she worked as a hairdresser's assistant, and then she found a post in a fashionable shop, a maison that dealt in the finery of the age, the ribbons and the lace and the trimmings and the hats with which the ladies of Paris adorned themselves. She became what the French called a grisette, a young working girl of the shops, and she served behind the counter and carried packages to customers and learned the trade of fashion from the inside, surrounded by silks and feathers and the endless small luxuries that the wealthy could not do without. The house in which she worked stood in one of the busy streets near the heart of the city, and the great ladies came to it in their carriages to be fitted and flattered, and to spend their husbands' money on ribbons and gauzes and the newest trimmings from the workrooms. A girl behind such a counter saw the whole spectacle of fashionable Paris pass before her, learned its tastes and its vanities and its little cruelties, and a clever and beautiful girl might learn too how much a pretty face was worth in such a world, and how it might be made to pay. It was honest work, and it suited her, for she had taste and an eye for fine things and the manner to charm the customers, and in another life she might have made a respectable career in the trade. But Jeanne was not an ordinary shop girl, for her beauty marked her out wherever she went, and a young woman so lovely could not pass unnoticed through the streets and shops of Paris. The wealthy men who frequented the fashion houses and the promenades saw her and admired her, and the attention of such men was both a flattery and a danger to a girl in her position. For a poor and beautiful young woman in that age, with no family to shield her and no fortune to fall back upon, the line between respectable work and the other path, the path of the kept woman and the courtesan, was perilously thin, and many a grisette who began behind a shop counter ended as the mistress of a wealthy protector. The pressures upon such a girl were enormous, and the rewards held out to her, the silks and the jewels and the comfort that her own labour could never buy, were correspondingly great. It was almost inevitable, given her beauty and her poverty and the world she moved in, that Jeanne Becu should be drawn toward that other path, and drawn she was, by slow and perhaps not entirely willing degrees, into the glittering and dangerous half-world of fashionable Paris, where beautiful women lived by the favour of rich men. She had no money and no protector, and a face that the whole city admired, and the choices before her were narrow and hard. The respectable poverty of the shop, with its endless labour and its meagre reward, lay on one side, and on the other lay the perilous brilliance of the demi-monde, where a beautiful girl might rise to luxury and ease, at the cost of her reputation and her safety. Which way she would go was in truth scarcely a choice at all, and it is into that half-world, the demi-monde that would carry her at last toward Louis himself, that we now follow her. The shadow society into which Jeanne now stepped was a recognised feature of Paris life, a glittering shadow cast by the wealth and the pleasure-seeking of the age. It was the half-world of the fashionable courtesans, the beautiful women who lived not by marriage or by honest trade, but by the favour and the money of rich men, and who occupied a strange and ambiguous place in the life of the city, despised in principle and courted in practice, excluded from respectable society, yet wielding a power of their own over the men who pursued them. The most celebrated of these women were famous throughout Paris, their names and their doings the subject of endless gossip, their carriages and their gowns as fine as those of any duchess, and the wealthiest and most fashionable men of the city competed for their favour. It was a precarious and a perilous existence, for a woman of the demi-monde depended entirely upon the men who kept her, and her position could collapse in an instant if she lost their favour or her looks began to fade. She lived without the protection of marriage, without security, without respectability, her whole fortune resting upon the fragile foundation of her face and the affection of her protectors, and many a woman who shone for a season in that brilliant demi-monde ended in poverty and disgrace when her day was done. Yet for a poor and beautiful young woman, with no other road to comfort and ease, it offered rewards that no honest trade could match, the silks and the jewels and the fine lodgings, the carriages and the servants, the brief, bright luxury that her own labour could never have won. Into this half-world Jeanne was drawn by her circumstances and her face, and she made her way in it as such women did, under the protection of wealthy men who admired her and provided for her. The details of these early years are obscure, hidden behind the gossip and the slander that would later be heaped upon her. But the broad shape of her existence is plain enough, for she moved through the fashionable demi-monde of Paris as a beautiful young woman of no fortune was apt to move, dependent upon the favour of rich admirers, learning the arts and the manners of that glittering shadow society. It was not the existence that a respectable girl was meant to lead, and the world would never let her forget how she had begun, but it was the life that her beauty and her poverty had marked out for her. And it was in this world that she came at last to the attention of the man who would change the whole course of her existence, a man who saw in her not merely a beautiful girl to be enjoyed, but an opportunity, a treasure to be used, a key that might unlock the most magnificent door in all of France. He was a sharp and unscrupulous adventurer, a man who lived by his wits and by the trade in beautiful women, and he understood, the moment he saw Jeanne Becu, that here was a beauty so far beyond the ordinary that she might be played for the very highest stakes of all. His name was Jean-Baptiste de Barry, and it is from him that she would one day take the name by which the world remembers her. Let us turn now to this man and to the extraordinary ambition that began to form in his mind. Jean-Baptiste du Barry was one of those figures that a great and corrupt capital throws up in every age, a man of charm and cunning and no scruples whatever, who lived by his wits at the edges of fashionable society. He came of a family of the minor gentry from the south of France, but he had long since abandoned any pretence of respectable life, and in Paris he had made himself the centre of a glittering and disreputable circle, a man who kept a fine house and a fine table, and surrounded himself with beautiful women, gambling and scheming, and trading upon the appetites of the rich. He was known by a nickname that summed him up, Leroux, the Rake, and he had a genius for the management of loveliness, for taking lovely young women of no fortune and placing them where their loveliness could be turned to profit. When this man first set eyes upon Jeanne Becu, he saw at once what he had found, for in all his dealings with beautiful women, he had never encountered a loveliness to equal hers. Here was beauty of the rarest kind, a face and a form and a manner so enchanting that men were undone by them, and Du Barry, with his sharp eye for the value of such things, understood that a treasure of this order was not to be wasted upon ordinary admirers. He took Jeanne into his own household and into his own keeping, and he set about polishing and presenting her, displaying her in his fashionable circle, where her face caused a sensation and her name began to be spoken throughout the pleasure-loving society of Paris. But Du Barry was not a man to be content with the profits of an ordinary arrangement, for he was an adventurer of large and audacious ambition, and as he watched the effect that Jeanne produced upon every man who beheld her, a daring idea began to take shape in his mind. He had heard, as all Paris had heard, that the old king at Versailles was sunk in melancholy and weariness, that since the death of Madame de Pompadour there had been no woman to hold his heart, that the most magnificent monarch in Europe was lonely and bored and ripe to be captivated. And Du Barry, looking at the incomparable beauty he had taken into his house, conceived the most audacious scheme that even his fertile and unscrupulous brain had ever produced. He would aim his treasure not at some wealthy nobleman or financier, but at the King of France himself. It was an idea of breathtaking boldness, almost of madness, for the distance between a beautiful nobody of the Paris demi-monde and the bedchamber of the monarch was so immense as to seem unbridgeable, and the obstacles of rank and etiquette and court intrigue were enough to daunt any ordinary schemer. But Du Barry was no ordinary schemer, and he believed, with the gambler's faith that ran in his blood, that beauty such as Jeanne's could overcome any obstacle, could batter down any door, if only it could be brought before the right eyes. So he set himself to the great project of his life, the placing of his beautiful protégée before King of France, and he began, with patience and cunning, to lay the groundwork for the most spectacular social ascent that the age would ever see. To understand how he might hope to succeed, we must turn now to the king himself, and to the lonely and weary man who waited, all unknowing, at the centre of the web that Du Barry was beginning to spin. Before we follow the great scheme to its conclusion, it is worth pausing to consider the girl herself, for it was upon her qualities, and not merely upon her protector's cunning, that the entire astonishing enterprise depended. By the time she came into Du Barry's keeping, Jeanne had grown into the full splendour of her face, and the descriptions that survive, even allowing for the exaggeration of admirers, suggest a loveliness genuinely out of the common run. She was of middle height and exquisitely formed, with that mass of ash-blonde hair, those wide and heavy-lidded blue eyes, that complexion of extraordinary fineness, and a soft, languorous, almost childlike sweetness of expression that contemporaries found irresistible. Hers was not the cold and stately beauty of a great lady, but something warmer and more inviting, a charm that seemed to promise gentleness and pleasure together. Yet loveliness alone, however dazzling, would not have carried her where she went, for the courts of kings have always been full of beautiful women, and mere prettiness, without something more, would have won her a season's admiration, and nothing further. What set Jeanne apart was the character that went with the face, a temperament of remarkable sweetness and good disposition, an easy, sunny, unaffected gaiety that charmed almost everyone who came near her. She had none of the calculating coldness, the sharp ambition, the cruelty that so often went with great looks in that hard and scheming world. She was, by all accounts, genuinely kind, slow to take offence and quick to forgive, careless of malice, generous to those who served her, and possessed of a natural warmth that made people wish to please her. This combination, the dazzling face joined to the warm and gentle nature, was the secret of her power, for it disarmed where mere prettiness might have provoked envy, and it bound men to her with affection as well as desire. People who came to mock her often left enchanted, and even her enemies, who had every reason to hate the upstart who had climbed so high, frequently confessed that there was no real harm in her, that she was good-natured and obliging, and bore no one any ill will. In a court that ran on malice and intrigue, on the careful nursing of grievances and the patient working of revenge, her sunny and forgiving disposition was a kind of marvel, and it would prove in the end. But to fekrift, og taltlæser de morsede kots were corruptments and colody and illoted to mangane, and the spacklon to comet. At a glass never led sprats no glachinum, yet spackle stones. So this was the treasure that Jean-Baptiste du Barry proposed to lay before the King of France, a young woman of incomparable loveliness and irresistible sweetness, with no learning and no birth and no fortune, but with a face and a manner that could enchant the weariest heart in Louisdom. The very qualities that made her so charming, her warmth, her gaiety, her freedom from the stiff calculation of the court, were precisely the qualities most likely to please a king grown tired of the cold formalities of his gilded prison. If only she could be brought before him, Du Barry was sure the rest would follow. The question was how to bridge the vast gulf between the demi-monde of Paris and the most exclusive court in Europe, and to understand the answer, we must look closely now at the lonely man who sat at the centre of that court, the king whose heart Du Barry meant to win. The king who sat at the centre of all this was Louis XV, and he was, by the time our story reaches him, a man of nearly 60, weary and melancholy, and sunk in the lengthy boredom of a reign that had lasted, by then, more than half a century. He had come to the throne as a small child, the great-grandson of the old Sun King, Louis XIV, and he had been the most beautiful and beloved child in France, called by his people the well-beloved in the bright morning of his reign. But the years had not been kind to his spirit, and the dazzling promise of his youth had curdled by degrees into a settled gloom, so that the monarch who reigned over the most magnificent court in Europe was, beneath the gilded surface of his days, a deeply unhappy man. His unhappiness had many sources. He was intelligent and not without ability, but he was idle and irresolute, oppressed by the cares of kingship that he had never wished for and never mastered, and tormented besides by a religious melancholy, a haunting fear of death and damnation that he could neither escape nor silence. He had a queen, the patient and pious Marie Leschinska, but the marriage had long since faded into mere formality, and Louis had sought consolation, through the long years of his reign, in a succession of mistresses, women who brought him pleasure and company, and a relief from the crushing tedium of his existence. The greatest of these had been Madame de Pompadour, who for 2 decades had been not merely his mistress, but his companion and his confidant, and in many ways the genuine ruler of his court. When Pompadour died, in the year 1764, she left a void in the king's life that nothing could easily fill, for she had been the centre of his world for so long that her loss seemed to take the last savour out of his pleasures. For a time he sought distraction in fleeting affairs, in young women brought to him for his amusement, but none of these touched his heart or eased his loneliness, and the monarch sank deeper into the melancholy that had always shadowed him. He was bored, profoundly and incurably bored, weary of the endless ceremony of his existence, weary of the cares of state, weary of the very pleasures that were supposed to console him, and he longed, though he scarcely knew it, for something to wake him from the lengthy grey dream his existence had become. This was the man, lonely and weary and ripe for enchantment, whom Jean-Baptiste du Barry meant to capture with the beauty of Jeanne Becu, and the moment, as it happened, was perfectly chosen. A king sunk in melancholy and boredom, mourning the companion of 20 years, surrounded by a cold and formal court that wearied him to death, was exactly the man to be captivated by a beauty of warmth and gaiety and dazzling loveliness, a creature so unlike the calculating ladies of his court that her very freshness would be a delight. If Du Barry could only bring his treasure before those weary royal eyes, the spark might catch, and the most spectacular ascent in the history of the French court might begin. The problem, as ever, was how to arrange the meeting, and to that problem, and to the cunning by which Du Barry solved it, we now turn. The problem that faced Jean-Baptiste du Barry was a formidable one, for a king did not simply meet whomever he pleased, and least of all a beautiful nobody from the Paris demi-monde. The whole life of Versailles was hedged about with ceremony, and guarded by the courtiers whose business it was to control access to the royal person, and a great barrier of etiquette and intrigue stood between the king and the world outside. To bring Jeanne to the king's notice, Du Barry needed an ally within the palace, someone close to the royal person who could be persuaded, by interest or by greed, to arrange the fateful meeting, and he set himself, with patience and cunning, to find such a man. He found his instrument in a figure who controlled in part the monarch's private pleasures, a man placed near the royal person who understood Louis's needs and was not too nice about how they were met. There were always, around a monarch like Louis, men whose business it was to manage the king's amusements, to find and arrange the young women who were brought to him in private, away from the formal eyes of Versailles, and Du Barry worked upon such men, dangling before them the prospect of a beauty more dazzling than any the monarch had yet seen. The promise of pleasing Louis, and of the rewards that might follow, was a powerful lure, and before long the arrangement was made. Jeanne would be brought before the king. The meeting, when it came, took place in the year 1768, and it was managed with the discretion that such things required. The beautiful young woman presented to the monarch in private, away from the watching court. An effect, as Du Barry had gambled it would be, was immediate and overwhelming. The weary, melancholy king, sunk in his boredom and his gloom, beheld a loveliness such as he had not seen in years, joined to a warmth and a gaiety and an unaffected sweetness that were balm to his jaded spirit, and he was captivated on the instant. Here was no cold and calculating court lady, no scheming beauty playing for advantage, but a creature of sunshine and laughter, fresh and warm and enchanting, and Louis, who had thought himself past such delights, found his heart stirring as it had not stirred since the days of his youth. What followed exceeded even Du Barry's most extravagant hopes, for the king did not merely enjoy the beautiful young woman and pass on to the next, as he had done with so many before her. He fell deeply and genuinely under her spell. There was something in Jeanne, in her warmth and her gaiety and her freedom from the airs of the palace, that touched the lonely king as none of his recent companions had touched him, and he found in her company a happiness and an ease that he had thought gone forever from his life. The fleeting amusement that Du Barry had schemed to arrange became something far greater, a genuine attachment, a love, and the monarch, to the astonishment and horror of his court, began to show every sign of wishing to keep this beautiful, nobody not for a night or a week, but as the established companion of his heart. The seamstress's daughter had captivated King of France, and the most scandalous chapter in the history of the court was about to begin. The king's infatuation, once it had taken hold, grew rapidly into something that astonished and alarmed everyone around him. Louis was no longer a young man, and his court had assumed that whatever pleasures he took with the youthful women brought to him would be fleeting and discreet, affairs of an evening that left no mark upon the settled order of things. But Jeanne was different, and the king's feeling for her was different, deeper and more lasting than anyone had expected, and within a short time it became clear that he was not going to put her aside. He wanted her near him, he wanted her always, and he began to lavish upon her the attention and the gifts and the marks of favour that signalled to the watching court that this was no passing fancy but a serious attachment. What had captured the monarch so completely was not merely the loveliness of her face, dazzling though that was, but the whole spirit of the favourite, the warmth and the gaiety and the easy, affectionate good humour that were so unlike anything in his stiff and formal world. The ladies of his court were creatures of calculation, forever watching and scheming, weighing every word for advantage, and Louis had grown weary to the blade of their cold and careful company. Jeanne was the opposite of all this. She laughed easily, she teased him, she treated him not with the frozen reverence of Versailles, but with a warm and natural familiarity, as though he were a man and not a monarch, and to the lonely, melancholy king this was a delight beyond price. In her company he could forget, for a while, the weight of his crown and the boredom of his existence. She had, too, a particular gift for raising his spirits and easing his black moods, for the king was subject to fits of melancholy and gloom that nothing seemed able to lift, and Jeanne, with her sunny temper and her gift for gaiety, could coax him out of his darkness as no one else could. She made him laugh, she made him forget his cares, she filled his apartments with a warmth and a lightness that had been absent for years, and the monarch, who had thought such happiness gone forever from his days, found himself rejuvenated, almost made young again, by the love of this beautiful and good-natured young woman. He could not do without her, and he made no secret of his devotion to the growing scandal of his court. For the court was horrified, and as Louis's infatuation deepened, the horror spread and hardened into something like panic among the great families of France. It was one thing for the king to amuse himself with a girl from the streets in private, as kings had always done, but it was quite another for him to fall genuinely in love with such a creature, to keep her by him, to shower her with favour, and worst of all, as it soon began to be feared, to wish to establish her openly as his official mistress, the successor to the great Pompadour. That such a position, with all its power and prestige and access to the monarch, should be filled by a creature from the very bottom of society, a former shop-girl and worse, was an outrage that the proud nobility of France could scarcely bring themselves to contemplate. But Louis's will was the king's will, and Louis, it was becoming clear, meant to have his way. The only question was how the thing could be managed, for there were formidable obstacles still to be overcome, and the first and greatest of these was the problem of her rank. The obstacle that now stood in the way was a matter of the rigid etiquette that governed every aspect of life at Versailles, for to be the monarch's mistress in private was one thing, but to be his official mistress, received and acknowledged at court, was quite another, and that position carried requirements that Jeanne, as she stood, could not meet. To be formally presented at court, to be received into the society of Versailles, a woman had to be of noble birth, a married lady of rank, and Jeanne Becu was neither noble nor married. She was an unmarried woman of the lowest origins, and by the iron rules of the palace she could no more be presented to Louis and Queen than she could fly. Some way had to be found to give her, at least in form, the rank that the etiquette demanded. The solution was as cynical as it was ingenious, and it came naturally enough from the fertile mind of Jean-Baptiste du Barry, who had brought Jeanne this far and did not mean to be balked now by a mere question of form. If she needed to be a married noblewoman in order to be presented, then a married noblewoman she should be made, and Du Barry had the means to make her one, for he had a brother. The plan was to marry Jeanne to this brother, Guillaume du Barry, a man of obscure noble birth from the south of France, and so to provide her, at a stroke, with both a husband and a title. She would become the Comtesse du Barry, a countess, a married lady of station, and the great obstacle of her birth would be, in form at least, overcome. The marriage was duly arranged and performed in the year 1768, a hollow ceremony entered into for no other purpose than to furnish Jeanne with the rank she needed, and false documents were prepared to disguise her humble origins and her true age, dressing up the seamstress's daughter as a woman of suitable birth. The bridegroom, Guillaume du Barry, played his part and then withdrew, retiring to the south and leaving his new wife to her destiny, for the marriage was never intended to be anything but a legal fiction. Jeanne Becu, the illegitimate daughter of a Lorraine seamstress, the former shopgirl and woman of the demi-monde, was now, on paper at least, the Comtesse du Barry, a married noblewoman fit, by the letter of the law, to be presented at the court of France. It was a transparent device, and no one at Versailles was deceived by it for a moment, for the entire court knew exactly who and what Jeanne was, and the hollow marriage and the borrowed title fooled nobody. But the forms had been observed, and that, at Versailles, was what mattered, for the court ran upon forms, and so long as the proper documents existed and the proper ceremonies had been performed, the thing could be done. The king now had what he needed to establish his beloved openly at his side, a mistress who was, in the eyes of the law, a married countess, and he set in motion the final step in her astonishing ascent, the formal presentation at court that would announce to all society that the seamstress's daughter had arrived at the very summit. That presentation, and the storm of scandal that surrounded it, is the next stage of our story. The formal presentation at court was the great public event by which a person was officially received into the society of Versailles, and for Jane it would be the moment that crowned her ascent, the instant in which Jane from the streets was acknowledged before the entire court as the king's recognised mistress. But the presentation could not simply be ordered, for it required, by the custom of the court, that an established lady of rank should agree to sponsor the newcomer, to present her formally to the monarch and queen, and no respectable noblewoman wished to soil herself by sponsoring the upstart from the demi-monde. The great ladies of Versailles, appalled at the whole business, closed ranks and refused, and for months the presentation was blocked by the simple device of finding no sponsor willing to perform it. And this resistance threw the court into a strange and protracted crisis, for Louis was determined that his mistress should be presented, and the nobility was equally determined to prevent it, and the struggle dragged on through the latter part of the year 1768 and into the next. The whole of fashionable France took sides and watched the contest with breathless attention, for it had become a trial of strength between the king's will and the pride of his nobility, fought out over the question of whether a former shopgirl should be received at court. At last a sponsor was found, an impoverished noblewoman willing, for a suitable consideration, to do what the great ladies would not, and the date for the presentation was fixed. The long resistance had been overcome, and the seamstress's daughter was to be received at Versailles after all. The presentation took place at last in the spring of 1769, and it was an occasion of extraordinary tension and splendour. Jeanne was dressed for the great moment in a gown of dazzling magnificence, sewn with diamonds and worth a fortune, her hair dressed high in the fashion of Versailles, the whole effect calculated to display her face to the fullest and to overwhelm the hostile eyes that would be fixed upon her. The galleries of Versailles were crowded as never before, for the entire court had assembled to witness the spectacle, half of them appalled, and half of them merely curious, all of them watching to see whether the upstart would falter, whether her low birth would betray her in the supreme test of court ceremony. But she did not falter. When the moment came, the Comtesse du Barry walked out into that sea of hostile and curious faces with a grace and a composure that astonished the very people who had come to sneer, and she made the deep, slow, formal curtsy of presentation with a perfection that no court lady could have bettered. The polish that the convent had given her, the natural grace that was her birthright, carried her through the ordeal in triumph, and the watching court was forced to concede that, whatever her origins, the woman knew how to carry herself like a queen. She had been schooled for the occasion with the greatest care, taught the 3 deep curtsies and the precise managing of the long train and the slow gliding walk that court ceremony demanded, drilled until the movements came without thought, and on the day itself she performed them flawlessly. The whispered hope of her enemies that she would stumble over her train or falter under the weight of all those hostile eyes came to nothing, and the very perfection of her bearing was, to some of them, the bitterest disappointment of all. The presentation was accomplished, the great barrier was crossed, and Jeanne Becu, the illegitimate child of a Lorraine seamstress, stood acknowledged before all society as the maîtresse en titre of the King of France. The most spectacular ascent the court had ever seen was complete, and now she had to learn to live at the dizzying summit she had reached. To be the maîtresse en titre, the official mistress of King of France, was to hold one of the most extraordinary positions in all of Europe, a place of glittering privilege and real power that had no exact equivalent in any other court. The official mistress was not merely the king's lover, but his acknowledged companion, established at court with her own apartments and her own household, treated with a deference second only to that shown the royal family itself, and possessed of an influence that the greatest in the land were obliged to court. She had the monarch's ear and Louis's affection, and through them she could shape appointments and dispense favours and advance or destroy the fortunes of those around her, so that the whole ambitious machinery of the palace turned, in part, upon winning her goodwill. Jeanne was installed in magnificent apartments at Versailles, lodged close to the king, surrounded by the luxury and the ceremony proper to her new station. She who had been a shop girl now had her own household of servants, her own attendants and ladies, her own carriages and horses, and an income that flowed from the royal treasury in a stream that seemed to have no end. The king, besotted and generous, denied her nothing, and the gifts and the money poured upon her on a scale that staggered even the extravagant court of Versailles. From the bottom of society she had climbed, in the space of a few short years, to a position of luxury and privilege that few women in society could match, lodged in a palace, dressed in diamonds, the acknowledged favourite of the most magnificent monarch in Europe. She had stepped too into a place hallowed by the memory of her formidable predecessor, for the position she now filled was the same that Madame de Pompadour had held for 20 years, and the comparison was inevitably drawn always to Jeanne's disadvantage. Pompadour had been a woman of taste and intelligence and political cunning, who had ruled the monarch's affections and meddled deeply in the government of Louisdom, a figure of true weight and accomplishment whatever one thought of her. Jeanne was nothing of the kind. She had no interest in politics and no head for affairs, no ambition to rule the kingdom or shape its policies, and in this she was utterly unlike the favourite whose place she had taken. She wished only to be happy, to enjoy her good fortune, to please the monarch and to be loved, and the great affairs of state held no attraction for her whatever. This lack of political ambition was, in truth, both a virtue and a weakness in her new position. It made her less dangerous than Pompadour had been, less of a meddler and a schemer, and it meant that she never sought to use her hold over Louis for grand designs of policy. But it also left her exposed, for it meant she had no party of her own built upon shared interest and ambition, no firm political base from which to defend herself against her foes, and enemies she had in plenty. The whole court, or very nearly the entire of it, resented and despised her, and a woman in her position who lacked the will and the skill to play the game of court politics was perilously vulnerable to those who wished her ill. For all her glittering elevation, the Comtesse du Barry stood upon uncertain ground, and the hostility that surrounded her was about to make itself felt. The hostility that surrounded the new favourite was unlike anything that had greeted her predecessors, for while every royal mistress had attracted envy and resentment, none had been so far beneath the rank of those she now moved among, and the proud nobility of France found the elevation of a former shopgirl a personal affront to their order. The great families who had served the crown for centuries, who counted their ancestors among the heroes of France, were now required to pay court to a creature who had risen from the gutter, to bow before the Comtesse du Barry, and seek her favour, and treat her with the deference due to the king's beloved, and many of them found the humiliation almost more than they could bear. Behind her back, and sometimes scarcely behind it, the court seethed with contempt for the upstart who had climbed so impossibly high. The contempt expressed itself in 1,000 small cruelties, in the snubs and the slights and the cold silences with which the proud ladies of Versailles made plain their disdain. They could not openly defy the monarch's will, for the favourite had Louise's protection and the king's affection, and open insult would have brought the royal displeasure down upon them. But they could freeze her with their manner, exclude her from their intimacy, make her feel at every turn the gulf that separated her origins from theirs, and this they did with all the refined cruelty that a proud and exclusive society could muster. Jeanne, for all the splendour of her position, was made to understand that she was tolerated rather than accepted, endured for the monarch's sake rather than welcomed for her own. Yet there was a faction at court that took the opposite course, for in the harsh arithmetic of Versailles the favour of Louise's mistress was a thing of value, and there were always those ambitious enough, or unscrupulous enough, to cultivate her despite her origins. Around every royal favourite there gathered a party of adherents and dependents, men and women who hoped to rise through her influence, who flattered her and served her and attached themselves to her fortunes, and Jeanne too acquired such a following. There were courtiers who saw in the king's devotion to her a path to advancement, ministers and nobles who calculated that the favourite's goodwill was worth having, and these formed about her a party of their own, set against the larger party of those who despised her. So the court divided, as courts always did, into factions for and against the favourite, and the Comtesse du Barry found herself, almost without willing it, at the centre of a web of intrigue and rivalry that she was ill-equipped to manage. She had no taste for politics and no skill in the deadly games of the court, and she wished only to enjoy her good fortune and be left in peace. But the position she held made her a player in those games whether she would or no, for her favour was a prize, and her hostility a danger, and the ambitious of the court ranged themselves around her accordingly, and among those who set themselves most firmly against her was the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king himself, the great minister who governed France, and who regarded the rise of the favourite with undisguised contempt. His name was the Duc de Choiseul, and his enmity would draw Jeanne into the deepest political struggle of her life. The Duc de Choiseul was, at the time of Jeanne's rise, the dominant figure in the government of France, a brilliant and powerful minister who had held the direction of affairs for many years and who governed the kingdom with an authority second only to the monarch's own. He was a great noble of wit and energy and worldly polish, accustomed to command, proud of his position, and contemptuous of anything that threatened it. And he looked upon the elevation of the Comtesse du Barry with a disdain that he was at no great pains to conceal. To a man of his rank and accomplishment, the spectacle of a former woman of the streets installed beside Louis was an absurdity and an offence, and he made the mistake, fatal as it would prove, of treating the favourite with open coldness and disrespect. Choiseul's hostility had roots that went deeper than mere snobbery, for he had reason to fear the influence of any royal mistress over the king, having owed much of his own rise to the patronage of the late Madame de Pompadour. He understood very well the power that a creature beloved of the monarch could wield, and he feared that the Comtesse du Barry, if she chose to use her influence against him, might shake his hold upon affairs. His response to this danger, however, was not to conciliate the favourite, but to oppose her, to throw the weight of his faction against her, to encourage the court's contempt, and to set himself at the head of the party that wished her gone. It was a calculation that rested upon his confidence in his own indispensability, his belief that Louis could not do without him whatever the favourite might wish. Ranged behind Choiseul stood a formidable array of forces, for he was backed by his powerful family and his many adherents, and above all by his sister, the Duchesse de Gramont, a proud and imperious woman who hated the favourite with a particular venom and who became one of her most relentless adversaries. The Duchess had ambitions of her own, it was whispered, to capture the king's heart and rule at Versailles in the favourite's place, and her failure to do so had turned her disappointment into a settled hatred. Between the two women there could be no peace, and the Duchesse threw the whole weight of her brother's faction into the campaign to drive the Comtesse du Barry from court, a campaign that would end, in the event, not in the favourite's fall, but in her brother's. The Choiseul faction was the great power at court, entrenched and confident, and its members treated the Comtesse du Barry with a disdain that was meant to put her in her place and to remind the king of where the real strength of his government lay. They underestimated, in their pride, both the depth of the monarch's attachment to his mistress and the danger of making a foe of a woman who, however little she cared for politics, had the ear of Louis every day and every night. For against the Choiseul faction they gathered, by degrees, an opposing party, made up of the minister's many opponents, the men whom he had thwarted or slighted or excluded from power over his long years of dominance, and they saw in the favourite a natural friend and a potent weapon. If the Comtesse du Barry could be persuaded to use her influence against Choiseul, to whisper against him to the king, then the minister who had ruled France so long might at last be brought down, and his opponents might rise in his place. So the contest between the favourite and the minister became the centre of a fierce political struggle, the focus of all the ambition and scheming of the court, and the gentle, pleasure-loving Jeanne, who wished only to be happy, found herself the unwilling standard around which the enemies of the most powerful man in France began to rally. The struggle would end, as such struggles did, in the fall of one party or the other, and it is to that dramatic reckoning that we now turn. The struggle between the favourite and the minister came to its crisis at the end of the year 1770, and it ended in a manner that astonished the court and demonstrated to all who had doubted it the real extent of the Comtesse du Barry's influence over the monarch. For all his confidence in his own indispensability, Choiseul had made a series of miscalculations in his policies and in his conduct that gave his enemies their opening, and the favourite, whether from genuine resentment of his insolence or from the urging of her faction, lent her weight against him at the decisive moment. Day after day, in the privacy of Louis's company, the case against the minister was pressed, and the king, weary of Choiseul's high-handedness and uneasy at his policies, at last made up his mind. The blow came in December, when the monarch dismissed Choiseul from all his offices and ordered him to retire to his estates, a stunning reversal for the man who had governed France for so long and who had believed himself secure. The mighty minister, who had treated the favourite with such contempt, was brought down, and the court understood at once the meaning of his disgrace, that the woman he had despised had proved stronger than he, that Louis's devotion to his mistress was a force that even the greatest minister could not safely defy. It was a triumph for the Comtesse du Barry and her faction, the most signal proof of her power that she would ever give, and it sent a shudder through the court, a recognition that the upstart favourite was a force to be reckoned with after all. Yet the triumph was double-edged, and in the long view it did Jeanne more harm than good, for the fall of Choiseul earned her the undying hatred of the powerful family and the wide faction that had supported him, and it confirmed her, in the eyes of many, as a malign and meddling influence over the king. Choiseul had been popular in certain circles, admired for his abilities and his policies, and his disgrace was blamed upon the favourite, who was painted as the low-born schemer who had pulled down a great statesman to gratify her spite. The libels and the slanders that already circulated against her grew sharper and more venomous, and the party of her enemies, swollen now by all the friends and adherents of the fallen minister, hardened in their resolve to be revenged upon her. And the fall of Choiseul had another consequence, more fateful still. For among those who had looked to the minister as their champion was the Austrian princess, who had lately come to France to marry the heir to the throne. Choiseul had been the architect of the alliance between France and Austria that her marriage was meant to seal, and he was regarded by the young Dauphine and by her mother, the Empress of Austria, as their friend and protector at the French court. His fall, brought about by the favourite, set the Dauphine against the Comtesse du Barry from the very beginning, and had laid the ground for a famous and bitter feud between the two women that would entertain and scandalise the whole of Europe. To understand that feud, we must turn now to the arrival at Versailles of the girl who would one day be queen, Marie Antoinette. In the spring of 1770, a few months before the fall of Choiseul, there arrived at the French court a girl of 14 who would one day become the most famous queen in the history of France. She was Maria Antonia, Archduchess of Austria, the youthfulest daughter of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa, and she had been sent to France to marry the Dauphin, the grandson and heir of King Louis, in order to seal the alliance between the two immense powers. In France, she took the name of Marie Antoinette, and she came to Versailles a charming, lively, headstrong young girl, proud of her imperial birth, raised to regard herself as the daughter of the greatest house in Europe, and wholly unprepared for the strange and treacherous world of the French court. The young Dauphine found, on her arrival, a court already divided and intrigue-ridden, and she found at its centre the figure of the Comtesse du Barry, whose position was a puzzle and an offence to the newcomer. To Marie Antoinette, raised in the strict and decorous court of Vienna by a mother of unbending virtue, the presence of the royal mistress was something shocking and incomprehensible, a scandal that her upbringing had not prepared her to confront. That a woman of such origins, a woman of no reputation, should hold so prominent a place at court, should be treated with honour and paid court by the nobility, struck the young princess as monstrous, and she conceived from the first a deep distaste for the favourite and all she represented. This natural distaste was sharpened and hardened by the counsel of those around her, for the Dauphine fell under the influence of the great ladies who hated the favourite, and above all of her aunts, the monarch's unmarried daughters, who detested the Comtesse du Barry, and were delighted to find an ally in the youthful Austrian princess. They encouraged her disdain, fed her sense of outrage, and impressed upon her that her dignity required her to hold herself entirely aloof from the favourite, to treat Louis's mistress as beneath her notice. The young and impressionable Dauphine took the lesson to heart, and she resolved that she would have nothing whatever to do with the Comtesse du Barry, that she would not so much as speak to her, and in this resolution she found a way to express both her own moral disapproval and the pride of her imperial blood. This was a graver matter than it might seem, for the rules of etiquette that governed Versailles were rigid and exact, and they laid down precisely who might speak to whom and in what manner. And by the custom of the court, a person of lower rank could not address one of higher rank until first spoken to. The Comtesse du Barry, for all her favour, ranked below the Dauphine, the future Queen of France, and so she could not speak to Marie Antoinette unless the Dauphine spoke to her first. By simply refusing ever to address a word to the favourite, the Dauphine could administer a perpetual and public snub, a standing insult that all the court would see and understand, and she set herself to do exactly that. So began the famous war of silence between the two women, a contest that would drag on for months and draw in the king and the Empress of Austria and the entire diplomacy of two great powers, all over the question of whether a queen-to-be would speak a single sentence to the monarch's mistress. The war of silence between the Dauphine and the favourite became, in the strange hothouse world of Versailles, a matter of the gravest importance, an affair that consumed the attention of the court and reached in time into the chancelleries of Europe. For the Comtesse du Barry, the Dauphine's refusal to speak to her was a public humiliation, a standing declaration before the whole court that the future queen regarded her as beneath contempt, and the favourite, and still more Louis, who loved her, felt the insult keenly. For the Dauphine, the silence was a point of honour and of conscience, a way of asserting her own dignity and her moral disapproval, and she clung to it with all the stubbornness of a proud and headstrong girl who had been told that her refusal was the mark of a virtuous princess. The king himself was drawn into the affair, for he cherished his mistress and wished her to be treated with respect, and the spectacle of his grandson's wife publicly snubbing the Comtesse du Barry was a vexation that he could not ignore. He let his displeasure be known, and the pressure upon the Dauphine to relent began to mount. More remarkably still, the affair reached all the way to Vienna, to the Empress Maria Theresa, who followed her daughter's conduct at the French court through a stream of letters, and who grew alarmed at the danger of the quarrel. For the Empress understood what her young daughter did not, that the alliance between France and Austria, so painfully constructed, depended upon the goodwill of the old king, and that it was the height of folly to risk that goodwill for the sake of a point of etiquette. So the Empress added her voice to the pressure, writing to her daughter to urge her to give way, to speak the single sentence that would end the affair, pointing out that to address a civil word to the favourite cost nothing, and that to persist in the quarrel might endanger interests of the greatest weight. The Dauphine resisted, reluctant to surrender, feeling that to speak to the favourite would be to compromise her dignity and betray her principles, and for a long time she held out against the combined pressure of her grandfather-in-law, the king, and her mother, the Empress. The contest of wills dragged on, the silence unbroken, the court watching and waiting to see whether the proud young princess would yield. At last, after months of deadlock, the Dauphine gave way, and the famous moment came when she spoke to the Comtesse du Barry at last, though she did so in a manner calculated to concede as little as possible. On a court occasion, with the favourite standing near, the Dauphine remarked, as if casually, that there were a great many folk at Versailles that day, a single trivial sentence addressed in the general direction of the Comtesse du Barry, and with that the favourite had to be content. The Empress Maria Theresa, reading of it in Vienna, was vastly relieved, for the strain of the affair had cost her months of anxious correspondence, while the king was satisfied and the favourite professed herself pleased. But the words had been wrung from the Dauphine by main force, and everyone understood it, so that the little victory tasted of defeat, and Marie Antoinette never forgave the humiliation of having been made to speak. It was the barest minimum that could satisfy the demand, a remark about the crowd that committed the Dauphine to nothing and acknowledged the favourite scarcely at all, but it was a sentence spoken, and the lengthy war of silence was technically ended. The Comtesse du Barry had her victory, such as it was, but the grudging and minimal temperament of the surrender showed how little real ground had been won, and the enmity between the two women remained as deep as ever beneath the thin show of civility. Set apart from the great struggles of politics and the bitter feuds of the court, the daily life of the Comtesse du Barry at Versailles unfolded in a round of luxury and ease that would have seemed, to the shop-girl she had been, a dream beyond all imagining. She rose late, in the manner of the court, and her time were filled with the pleasant occupations of a woman who wanted for nothing the long ritual of dressing and the tending of her famous beauty, the receiving of visitors, the society of the monarch, the endless small business of a fashionable existence at the most magnificent court in Europe. She had her own apartments, her own household of servants and attendants, and the means to indulge every taste and every whim, and she lived, by all accounts, with the light-hearted enjoyment of one who could scarcely believe her own good fortune. The tending of her appearance was naturally a matter of the first importance, for her charm was the foundation of her entire position, and had to be maintained and displayed with the greatest care. Hours were given to the dressing of her hair, piled high in the towering fashion of the day and adorned with feathers and flowers and jewels, to the choosing and the wearing of her magnificent gowns, to the whole elaborate art of presenting herself to the court in a manner worthy of Louise's favourite. She had a taste for delicate and luxurious things, for soft colours and fine fabrics and exquisite ornament, and she dressed not with the heavy magnificence of a great lady, but with a lighter, more charming elegance that suited her particular loveliness. Around her gathered her own little court, the household and the attendants and the favoured visitors who made up her daily company, and here she was happiest, for among her own people she could lay aside the strain of the hostile court and be the warm, gay, good-natured creature that she was by nature. A small dog was her constant companion, and she kept about her too a young black page in a turban and a coat of brocade, a figure much painted by the artists of the day, who attended her and carried her train and added a note of exotic colour to her apartments in the fashion that the age admired. Her rooms were full of birds and flowers and pretty trifles, of soft cushions and embroidered hangings and the 100 small comforts that made her surroundings a refuge from the cold magnificence of the palace beyond her door. She was kind to her servants and generous to her dependents, easy and affectionate in her manner, and those who served her grew devoted to her, for she treated them with a consideration that great ladies seldom showed. She kept her pets and her small amusements, surrounded herself with pretty things, and filled her apartments with an atmosphere of warmth and ease that was the very opposite of the cold formality of the court beyond her doors, and always, at the centre of her time, there was the king, for it was his affection that was the source of all her splendour, and the maintaining of his devotion was, in a sense, her one genuine occupation. She spent much of her day in his company, easing his melancholy and lightening his cares, providing him with the warmth and the gaiety and the affectionate ease that he could find nowhere else, and the monarch, in return, surrounded her with every luxury and denied her nothing. Theirs was in its strange way a genuine attachment, an affection that went beyond the merely physical, and Louis grew more dependent upon her as the time passed, more attached to the comfort and the happiness she brought him. It was a good existence, one of luxury and ease and royal favour, and at its heart lay the things that the king lavished upon his beloved, the gowns and the houses and, above all, the dazzling jewels and the luxury that surrounded her. But before we turn to those splendours, let us look at the world of ceremony she had to master, for the court she now inhabited was the most formal in Europe. When the Comtesse du Barry was raised to her glittering position, she had to learn, almost overnight, the elaborate and exacting ceremony that governed every hour of life at Versailles, for the court of France was the most formal in Europe, hedged about with a ritual so intricate that it took a lifetime to master. The whole existence of the court was ordered by rules of etiquette that fixed precisely who might do what, who might sit and who must stand, who might enter which room and in what order, and a person who broke these rules, however unknowingly, exposed themselves to ridicule and contempt. For a woman raised from the streets, with no breeding and no training in the ways of the court, this world of ceremony was a perilous maze, and the hostile eyes of the courtiers were always watching for the misstep that would betray her low origins. The daily life of the king was itself a ceremony, conducted according to a ritual that had scarcely changed since the time of the old Sun King, and the Comtesse du Barry, as the favourite, was drawn into this round of formality. There was the rising of the king in the morning, the levee, when the courtiers were admitted in strict order of rank to attend upon the monarch as he was dressed, and the corresponding ceremony of his retiring at night, and 100 other observances that filled the royal day. Every act of the king's existence, his waking and his dressing and his dining and his praying, was performed in public, surrounded by attendants, governed by rules, and the favourite who lived at the centre of his life had to know and to navigate this whole elaborate system. The Comtesse du Barry, to the surprise of those who had expected her to fail, learned the ways of the court with a quickness that did credit to the natural grace that had always been her gift, the polish that the convent had given her, the instinctive elegance that was her birthright, carried her through the ordeal of court ceremony with a poise that her foes had not expected, and though she could never acquire the deep, unconscious ease of those born to that world, she learned enough to hold her own. She made her mistakes, no doubt, and the watchful courtiers noted them with malicious satisfaction, but she did not disgrace herself, and she bore herself, on the whole, with a dignity and a grace that won a grudging respect even from those who despised her. Yet the ceremony of the court was, for all that, a strain and a burden to her, for it was utterly foreign to her warm and easy temperament, and she was happiest when she could escape from it into the freedom of her own apartments or the quiet of Louveciennes. She had not been bred to the cold formality of Versailles, and the endless ritual, the perpetual watching of unfriendly eyes, the strain of carrying herself always with the correctness that her position demanded, wearied and oppressed her. It was one of the ironies of her position that the splendour she had climbed so high to reach brought with it this burden of ceremony that her disposition found so uncongenial, and that the warm, gay, informal creature she was by nature had to spend her days amid the stiffest formality in Europe. To escape it, she fled whenever she could, to the freedom and the ease of her own circle, and it is to that circle, away from the formal court, that we now turn, away from the cold formality of the court. The Comtesse du Barry gathered about her a circle of her own, a band of friends and adherents and agreeable folk in whose society she could lay aside the strain of her position, and be the warm, easy creature that she was by nature. For the favourite, like every great personage at Versailles, had her own household and her own following, the folk who served her and depended upon her and made up her daily company, and among them she could relax into the gaiety and the informality that the stiff court denied her. Her circle was not the grandest at Versailles, for the highest nobility held aloof from the upstart favourite, but it was a warm and lively set, and she presided over it with the generous warmth that made her so beloved by those who knew her well. Among her intimates were the members of the du Barry family who had risen with her and clung to her fortunes, and above all Jean-Baptiste du Barry, the schemer who had launched her upon her astonishing career, and who hoped to profit by her elevation. There was a young niece of his, sometimes called Chon, who became a close companion of the favourite and a fixture of her household, and there were others of the family and the connection who attached themselves to her good fortune and shared in her splendour. The Du Barrys were not a distinguished or a reputable clan, and their presence about the favourite was one of the things her enemies held against her, but they were her own, bound to her by interest and habit, and she was loyal to them, as she was loyal to all who were close to her. Beyond the family, the Comtesse du Barry drew about her the artists and the agreeable people whose company she preferred to the stiff society of the court, the painters who recorded her face, the craftsmen who adorned her houses, the writers and the wits who could amuse and please her. She had a taste for pleasant company and easy conversation, for the warm and informal society of people who liked her for herself, and she created around her, both at Versailles and at Louveciennes, an atmosphere of gaiety and good humour that was the very opposite of the cold intrigue of the court. Those who were admitted to her intimacy found a hostess of charm and generosity, and many who came to her circle out of interest remained out of genuine affection. It was in this circle, among her own folk, that the true nature of the Comtesse du Barry showed itself most clearly, the warm and generous and good-natured woman who lay beneath the glittering favourite of the libels. Here she could be at her ease, affectionate and gay, free from the strain of the hostile court, surrounded by people who loved her, and here she found the happiness that the splendour of her position could not by itself provide. The contrast between the warm informality of her own circle and the cold formality of the court she had to inhabit was one of the deep divisions of her career at Versailles, and it explains much of her longing for the freedom of Louveciennes, where she could gather her friends about her and live in the easy gaiety that suited her temperament. But her position involved her, whether she would or no, in matters beyond her own circle, in the great affairs of the court and the kingdom, and it is to her place in those larger matters that we now turn. The position of royal favourite carried with it, whether the favourite wished it or not, a place in the great affairs of the court and the kingdom, for the woman who held the king's heart held also a measure of influence over the dispensing of power and favour, and the ambitious of the court could not ignore her. The Comtesse du Barry had no taste for politics and no head for affairs, and she sought no grand role in the government of France, unlike the formidable Pompadour, who had ruled the king's policies as well as his heart. But the mere fact of her influence over the king made her a force in the politics of the court, for her goodwill could advance a career, and her hostility could blight one, and the men who sought power had to reckon with the favourite, whether she cared for their schemes or not. Her one great intervention in affairs had been the part she played in the fall of the Duc de Choiseul, and that intervention, though it sprang more from personal resentment than from any policy of her own, had shaken the government and demonstrated the reach of her influence. After Choiseul's fall, the direction of affairs passed to a group of ministers who were friendly to the favourite, or at least who owed something to her party, and for a few years the Comtesse du Barry was associated, in the public mind, with the government that ruled France. Chief among these ministers was a hard and able man named Maupeou, who undertook a bold and controversial reform of the courts of justice, and the favourite's name was linked with his, so that the unpopularity of his measures was visited, in part, upon her. In truth, her role in all this was slight, for she neither understood nor cared for the great questions of policy that the ministers debated, and she was content to leave the business of government to those whose business it was. But her position made her a symbol and a focus, and the enemies of the government she was associated with attacked her along with it, blaming her for measures she had no hand in, and casting her as the corrupt influence behind the throne. The libels that blackened her name made much of her supposed meddling in affairs, painting her as a sinister power who governed France from the king's bed, and though the charge was largely false, it stuck, and it added to the burden of hatred that she carried. So the Comtesse du Barry became, against her own inclination, a figure in the politics of the court, drawn into the rivalries and the intrigues by the mere fact of her position, blamed for policies she had not made, and credited with a power she did not really wield. It was one of the burdens of her elevation that she could not escape this involvement, that the favour of the king made her a player in games she had no wish to play, and that the hatred earned by the government became in part her own. Had she been a woman of political ambition, like Pompadour, she might have used her position to true effect and built herself a party of grateful dependents who would have stood by her in her hour of need. But she was not, and her lack of any real political base would leave her, when the day of danger came, with no defenders but those who cherished her for herself. From the affairs of the court, let us turn back to the woman herself, and to the famous beauty that was the foundation of it all. The beauty that had lifted the Comtesse du Barry from the gutter did not stand still once she reached the summit, for at Versailles she had at her command every art and every resource that could enhance what nature had given her. The finest hairdressers, the cleverest dressmakers, the most skilful makers of every adornment were hers to employ, and under their hands her natural loveliness was set off and heightened, until she became one of the acknowledged beauties of an age that prized beauty above almost everything. More than that, she became a leader of fashion, for as the favourite of the king she occupied a position from which the styles of the whole fashionable world could be dictated, and what she wore one season, the ladies of the court and the city would be wearing the next. She had a taste of her own, inclining to the soft and the delicate rather than the heavy and magnificent, to pale colours and fine fabrics and a light, graceful elegance. And through her this manner spread outward through the fashionable world, so that her preferences shaped, for a few years, the very look of elegant France. As the favourite of the king, the Comtesse du Barry set fashions that the ladies of the court and the city followed, for what the king's beloved wore became, by that fact, the height of the mode, and the dressmakers and the milliners and the hairdressers watched her for the latest turn of fashion. She had her own hairdresser, a celebrated artist of the towering coiffures that were then in vogue, and her own dressmakers who created for her the gowns that set the styles, and through her the soft and graceful elegance that was her taste, spread through the fashionable world. It was a power of a kind, this leadership of fashion, less weighty than the power of politics but more congenial to her nature, and she exercised it with the natural feeling for the lovely that was among her truest gifts. Yet the loveliness that was the foundation of her fortune was also, like all beauty, a fading thing, and the Comtesse du Barry could not but be aware that the gift which had raised her would not last forever, that the bloom of her youth would fade and her looks decline, and that with it might go the favour that rested upon it. It was the anxiety that haunted every beauty whose fortune depended upon her looks, the knowledge that time was the enemy, that those years would steal away the very thing on which everything was built. As it happened, the king's death cut short her favour before age could wither her looks, and she fell, not as a faded charmer cast aside, but as a still lovely woman robbed of her protector by death. But the anxiety had been real while it lasted, the shadow that fell across the brightest charm, and it was one more of the insecurities that underlay the splendour of her position. From her beauty and her fashions, let us turn to the scale of the luxury in which she lived. Yet for all that she led the fashions of her day, there was nothing hard or grasping in her vanity, no cold calculation in the way she adorned herself, but rather the simple delight of a woman who had been poor and was poor no longer, and who took an almost childlike pleasure in beautiful clothes and beautiful jewels, and the freedom to indulge a taste that her early years had starved. It was this, perhaps, as much as her beauty, that the old king found so endearing in her, the freshness of her pleasure in the splendour he could give. The scale of the luxury in which the Comtesse du Barry lived during the years of her favour was prodigious even by the standards of the most extravagant court in Europe, for the king denied her nothing, and the wealth of France flowed through her hands in a stream that seemed to have no end. She who had been a poor shop girl, counting her few coins, now commanded an income that would have maintained a princely household, and she spent it with the open-handed freedom of one who had never had money and could not quite believe in its limits. The sums laid out upon her houses and her jewels and her gowns and her household and her pleasures, ran into figures that staggered even the spendthrift court, and the scandal of her expense was one of the loudest complaints against her. Her household alone was an establishment of great size and cost, for the favourite kept her own court in miniature, with her servants and her attendants and her ladies, her carriages and her horses, her cooks and her grooms, and the whole apparatus of a great personage. Everything about her had to be of the finest, for she was the king's beloved, and her state had to reflect his magnificence, and the maintenance of her household devoured a fortune year by year. She kept a table of the greatest luxury. She entertained on a lavish scale. She surrounded herself with every comfort and every refinement that money could buy, and the cost of it all fell upon the royal treasury, which the king opened to her without stint. Then there were the houses, the apartments at Versailles and the other royal residences, and above all her beloved Louveciennes, which she adorned and improved at enormous expense, building the lovely pavilion and filling it and the chateau with the finest furniture and the most beautiful objects. The decoration and the furnishing of her houses, the commissioning of works of art, the gathering of fine things, all cost sums that mounted into the hundreds of thousands, and the Comtesse du Barry, with her genuine love of beautiful things, and her access to a king's purse, indulged her taste on a scale that few could match. And over and above all this were the jewels, the diamonds and the precious stones that she gathered into one of the most splendid collections in Europe, the most concentrated form of the wealth that the king lavished upon her. The total of all this expense, the houses and the household and the jewels and the pleasures, amounted to a fortune that helped to feed the growing resentment against the monarchy, for in a kingdom sinking ever deeper into debt, the spectacle of such sums lavished upon a low-born favourite was a scandal that the enemies of the regime did not fail to exploit. The Comtesse du Barry was made the symbol of the extravagance and the waste of the old order, the low-born woman upon whom the wealth of France was squandered while the people groaned under their burdens, and the libels dwelt upon the scale of her spending as the proof of the corruption of the monarchy. There was injustice in this, for she was far from the only drain upon the treasury, and the troubles of France ran far deeper than the expense of one favourite. But she was a convenient and a conspicuous target, and the resentment of her luxury was real. And of all the forms that her luxury took, none was more famous or more fateful than the precious stones that the king lavished upon her without limit. To those we now turn. Of all the luxuries that the monarch lavished upon his beloved, none was more famous or more ruinously expensive than the gems, for the Comtesse du Barry had a passion for precious stones, and Louis indulged it without limit. She accumulated, over the time of her favour, a collection of gems of extraordinary magnificence, ropes of pearls and rivers of diamonds, ornaments and settings of the finest workmanship, a treasure in precious stones that was reckoned among the most splendid in private hands anywhere in Europe. The jewellers of Paris grew rich upon her custom, for the king spared no expense in adorning his mistress, and the sums laid out upon them ran into figures that scandalized even the extravagant court. The diamonds were more than mere ornament, for in an age when a woman of her position could own little in her own right, they were a form of wealth that was truly hers, a portable treasure that she could keep and carry and, if need be, sell, and they represented a kind of security against the uncertain future that every royal favourite had to fear. A mistress held her position only so long as the monarch lived and loved her, and when that protection was withdrawn, she might be left with nothing. So the prudent favourite gathered what she could against the evil day, and the stones were the most concentrated and portable form of such a hoard. It was for this reason that she clung to her jewels through every change of fortune, and that their loss, when it came, struck at her so deeply, for they were not mere ornament, but the very ground of her security, the one form of wealth that no royal whim could take from her. A single great ornament might be worth more than a country estate, and the favourite gathered such ornaments by the dozen, until her collection was reckoned among the wonders of the court. Jeanne's love of jewels, then, was not mere vanity, though vanity it certainly was in part, but also a kind of insurance, a treasure laid up against the day when Louis's protection should fail. It was in connection with the favourite's love of jewels that one of the most famous episodes of the age had its distant origin, for the court jewellers, Belmer and his partner, conceived the idea of creating a necklace of surpassing magnificence, a diamond necklace of fabulous value, in the hope of selling it to the Comtesse du Barry as the supreme ornament of the king's favourite. They gathered the finest stones and laboured to assemble a necklace worthy of a queen, an object of staggering cost, expecting that the monarch would buy it for his beloved. But before the necklace could be sold, Louis died, and the favourite fell, and the jewellers were left with their fabulous and unsaleable creation on their hands, the seed of a scandal that would, years later, help to bring down the monarchy itself. But that lay in the future. In the bright years of her favour, the Comtesse du Barry shone with her diamonds at the heart of the court, a dazzling figure blazing with precious stones, the living symbol of the king's devotion and of the luxury that his love could command. The jewels were the visible sign of her astonishing fortune, the seamstress's daughter decked in a treasure that empresses might envy, and they expressed more vividly than anything else the dizzying height to which she had climbed. They were also, in their way, the measure of the monarch's helpless infatuation, for no prudent monarch would have squandered such sums upon a mistress, and the scale of his spending upon her jewels was one of the things for which the favourite was most bitterly resented and most savagely attacked. From the diamonds that adorned her, let us turn to the loveliest of all Louis's gifts, the country retreat where she was happiest, the pavilion of Versailles. The loveliest of all the gifts that the king bestowed upon his beloved was a place rather than a thing, for he gave her the chateau of Versailles, set upon the heights above the river, Seine to the west of Paris, with the view across the valley that was among the most beautiful in France. It was here, more than anywhere, that the Comtesse du Barry was happy, for at Versailles she could escape the strain and the hostility of Versailles, and live, for a time, in the quiet pleasure of a country retreat, surrounded by beauty and ease, away from the cold eyes of the court. The place became her own particular kingdom, the setting of her dearest pleasures, and it would remain, through all the changes of her later life, the home of her heart. The chateau itself was a handsome house, but the monarch's generosity did not stop there, for the Comtesse du Barry commissioned, in the grounds, the building of a new pavilion of exquisite design, a small and perfect garden house in which to entertain and to enjoy the famous view. The architect she chose was a young man of brilliant gifts named Claude Nicolas Ledoux, who would later become one of the most original and celebrated builders of the age, and he created for her a jewel of a building, a pavilion of classical elegance and refinement, perfectly proportioned and exquisitely finished, set like an ornament upon the heights above the river. It was a small masterpiece, the most admired building of its kind in France, and it embodied the lightness and the grace and the delicate luxury that were the marks of her taste. When it was finished, the pavilion was unveiled with a celebrated supper at which the king himself was present, and the company dined to music in rooms panelled and gilded and hung with paintings, looking out through tall windows at the silver thread of the Seine far below. The evening was talked of for years afterwards as one of the most exquisite entertainments of the reign, a perfect marriage of architecture and music, and the soft summer dark, and it fixed the fame of Louveciennes as the loveliest of all the favourites' retreats. In this lovely setting, the Comtesse du Barry entertained with a charm and a hospitality that even her foes were forced to admire. The suppers at Louveciennes became famous, occasions of elegance and gaiety, where the favourite presided as a gracious and generous hostess, and Louis himself cherished to come there, to escape with his beloved into the quiet pleasure of the place, to enjoy the view and the company, and the warm, easy atmosphere that Jeanne created wherever she went. Louveciennes was the scene of her happiest hours, the spot where she could be most fully herself, and the memory of its beauty and its peace would sustain her through the dark years that were to come. For there was in the Comtesse du Barry a genuine love of loveliness and of gracious living that found its fullest expression at Louveciennes, and that lifts her, in the eyes of posterity, somewhat above the mere greedy adventuress that her enemies painted. She had taste, genuine taste, an eye for the lovely and the elegant, and she spent the king's money not only upon diamonds and gowns but upon beautiful buildings and beautiful objects, upon the patronage of fine artists, and the creation of things of lasting loveliness. Louveciennes was the monument of that taste, and it stands, even in the memory, as the symbol of the gentler and more attractive side of her temperament, the side that loved beauty and peace and the company of pleasant people. It was here, in this lovely retreat, that her patronage of the arts found its happiest scope, and it is to that patronage and to the painters and craftsmen she favoured that we turn next. The Comtesse du Barry was, in her quiet way, a notable patron of the arts, and the money that the monarch poured upon her flowed out again, in part, to the painters and the sculptors and the craftsmen whose work adorned her houses and recorded her loveliness. She had grown up with no education in the fine arts, no schooling in taste, but she possessed a natural feeling for beauty, an instinct for the elegant and the graceful, and she used her position and her wealth to surround herself with lovely things and to support the artists who made them. In this she followed the example of the great Pompadour, though without her predecessor's learning and discernment, and the patronage of Louis's favourite was a prize worth having for the artists of the age. Among the painters she favoured, the foremost was François Hubert Rouet, who painted her likeness many times, capturing in his elegant and flattering portraits the soft, fair, languorous beauty that had captivated the king. Through these portraits, and through the work of the other artists who painted her, the image of the Comtesse du Barry was fixed for posterity. The golden hair, the blue eyes, the gentle and inviting loveliness, preserved upon canvas as it had been in life. In her own day, these likenesses were prized as the image of the most beautiful woman in France, and they remain the truest record we have of the face that undid a king. Her patronage extended beyond the painters to the craftsmen and the makers of beautiful objects, for she filled her houses with the finest products of the age, the furniture and the porcelain and the silver and the countless luxurious things with which the rich adorned their lives. The pavilion at Louveciennes was a showcase of the finest craftsmanship of the day, fitted up and furnished with exquisite taste, and the Comtesse du Barry employed the leading makers and decorators to create for her a setting of refined and delicate luxury. Her commissions were a source of profit and prestige to the craftsmen who received them, and through her patronage she contributed, in her small way, to the flowering of the decorative arts that marked the last brilliant years of the old French monarchy. The cabinet makers who supplied her, the bronze workers who cast her mounts and fittings, the porcelain makers of Sèvres whose wares she favoured, all profited by her custom, and the things they made for her were among the loveliest products of an age that excelled in such work. She had, too, a particular love of flowers and of gardens, and the grounds of Louvciennes were planted and tended with a care that made them famous, so that her patronage reached even to the gardeners and the nurserymen who stocked her borders and her hothouses with rare and beautiful blooms. In all this there was a genuine love of loveliness, and it forms one of the more attractive features of her character, for the Comtesse du Barry took real pleasure in lovely things and true care in the patronage of those who made them. She was not a woman of deep cultivation, and she could not have discoursed learnedly upon the arts as Pompadour had done, but she had something perhaps more valuable, a true and natural feeling for beauty, an instinctive response to the elegant and the graceful, and she used her fortune to create around herself a world of refinement and loveliness. This love of loveliness, joined to the sweetness of her nature, gives the lie to the cruel caricature of the greedy and vulgar adventuress, and it is worth dwelling upon, for it was one of the qualities that made her, despite her origins and her position, a creature whom many came to regard with real affection, to that sweetness of temperament, the quality that even her foes could not deny, we turn next. If there is one quality that shines through all the accounts of the Comtesse du Barry, even the hostile ones, it is the sweetness of her disposition, that genuine good-heartedness that set her apart from so many who rose to greatness in that hard and scheming age. She was, by the testimony of those who knew her, a woman of real kindness, generous and forgiving, and free from malice, and this gentleness of disposition was perhaps the most surprising thing about her, given the court from which she came and the world in which she moved. The court of Versailles ran upon cruelty and intrigue, upon the careful nursing of grievances and the patient working of revenge, and a woman in her exposed position might have been expected to learn its hard lessons and to use her power for vengeance upon her many enemies. But she did not. The most striking proof of her good disposition was her conduct toward those who had wronged her, for she had foes in plenty, people who had snubbed and insulted and slandered her, and she had the power, through her influence with the monarch, to do them real harm. Yet she used that power for vengeance hardly at all, preferring to forgive and to forget, careless of the slights she had suffered, slow to take offence and quick to let it go, even toward the Choiseul faction, who had treated her with such contempt. She bore no lasting grudge, and there are stories of her interceding with Louis on behalf of folk who had wronged her, of her kindness to those who had every reason to expect her enmity. In a court where revenge was a fine art, her readiness to forgive was a thing of wonder. Her generosity, too, was remarked by all who knew her, for she gave freely and lavishly to her servants and her dependents, to those in need, to anyone who appealed to her good nature, and she had the open hand and the warm heart of one who had known poverty herself and could not bear to see want in others. The money flowed through her fingers as fast as the king poured it in, much of it spent upon her own pleasures, but much of it, too, given away in acts of kindness and charity, for she could refuse no one and took genuine pleasure in giving. Her servants adored her, her dependents blessed her, and even those who disapproved of her position often found, when they came to know her, that there was no real harm in her, that she was good-natured and obliging and wished no one ill. There are stories of her quietly paying the debts of strangers, of her finding places for the children of her servants, of small kindnesses done without display and without any thought of advantage, and they have the ring of truth, for they fit with everything else that is known of her warm and open heart. This sweetness of disposition was, in the end, both her greatest charm and her fatal weakness, for it endeared her to many, but it left her defenceless in the savage world of the court. She lacked the hardness, the calculation, the capacity for ruthlessness that survival at Versailles required, and her very gentleness made her an easy target for those who wished her ill. She could not scheme, she could not hate effectively, she could not defend herself by the methods that the court understood, and when the day of danger came, she would have no party of grateful and obligated dependents bound to her by interest, no network of alliances built upon mutual advantage, but only the affection of those who loved her for herself. It was not enough, in that world, and the contrast between her gentle nature and the cruelty of those who hunted her would give her story. In the end, its peculiar pathos, but the cruelty was already at work against her in the shape of the savage libels that blackened her name, and it is to those that we now turn. For all her gentleness, the Comtesse du Barry was the object of a campaign of slander and abuse as savage as any that the age produced, for her rise had made her enemies without number, and they took their revenge upon her in the only way open to them, through the poisoned pen. The 18th century was the great age of the clandestine pamphlet and the scurrilous song, the underground press that flourished beyond the reach of the censors and poured out a stream of libel against the great, and the favourite of the monarch was its favourite target. The pamphlets and the songs and the satirical verses circulated through Paris and the court in their thousands, blackening her name, mocking her origins, and dwelling with relish upon every scandal, true or invented, of her past. The libels played, above all, upon her humble birth and her disreputable youth, raking over the obscure years of her early life, exaggerating and inventing, painting her as a creature of the gutter who had clawed her way to greatness by the lowest means. Her origins in the demi-monde, her years under the protection of Jean-Baptiste du Barry, the whole murky history of her rise, were laid out and embroidered and held up to the scorn of the public, and the contrast between her squalid beginnings and her present magnificence was made the theme of endless mockery. Nothing was too coarse or too cruel for the pamphleteers who competed with one another in the savagery of their attacks, and the name of the Comtesse du Barry became, in the underground press, a byword for vice and corruption and the degradation of the monarchy. These attacks were not merely personal, for they served a larger purpose, becoming a weapon in the growing assault upon the monarchy itself. The favourite was an easy and a tempting target, and through her the critics of the regime could strike at Louis and the entire corrupt system that had raised a woman of the streets to such a height. The spectacle of the ageing king lavishing the wealth of France upon a low-born mistress was made to stand for everything that was rotten in the old order, for its extravagance, its frivolity, its moral decay, and the libels against the Comtesse du Barry fed the rising tide of contempt for the monarchy that would in time help to sweep it away. She was, without willing it, a symbol as well as a creature, and the abuse heaped upon her was aimed, in part, at the throne behind her, an halidand. The cruelty of these attacks fell upon a woman who had, in truth, done little to deserve such hatred, for whatever her origins and her position, she was no monster of vice and corruption, but a gentle, pleasure-loving creature who wished no one ill. The gap between the real woman and the hideous caricature of the libels was vast, but it was the caricature that lodged in the public mind, and the Comtesse du Barry would carry the burden of that blackened reputation to the end of her time and beyond. The poison did its work, and when at last the revolution came and the reckoning was demanded, the savage image created by the libels would help to send her to her death. But all that lay in the future, and for now, in the bright years of her favour, the libels were a torment, but not yet a danger, for the king's protection stood between her and her foes. It is to that protection, and to the deepening devotion of the ageing king, that we turn next. As that period of her favour lengthened, the attachment between the ageing king and his beautiful mistress deepened into something settled and profound, a companionship that went far beyond the first infatuation and that became, for the lonely monarch, the chief comfort of his declining years. Louis was growing old, sinking ever deeper into the melancholy and the weariness that had always shadowed him, oppressed by the cares of a kingdom he had never learned to govern, and haunted by the fear of death and judgment that grew sharper as his end drew nearer. And in the midst of all this gloom, the Comtesse du Barry was his one bright spot, the warm and gay and affectionate presence that could still coax a smile from him and lighten, for a while, the darkness of his spirit. She had grown skilled in the management of his moods, in the gentle art of easing his black humours and drawing him out of his melancholy, and the king came to depend upon her for this, as for everything else. He liked to have her near him, to escape with her to Louvciennes or to her apartments, to forget in her warm and easy company the weight of his crown and the terrors of his conscience. Theirs was no longer the affair of an old man and a young beauty, but a true companionship, an affection grounded in habit and gratitude and real attachment. And the king, who had loved many women in his time, found in this last of his mistresses a comfort and a contentment that he had perhaps never known before. The court watched this deepening devotion with a mixture of resignation and renewed alarm, for it was plain that the favourite's hold upon the king was stronger than ever, and that there was no prospect of her being displaced while he lived. The factions that had hoped to see her fall had been disappointed, and the Comtesse du Barry seemed securely established at the king's side, her position guaranteed by his unwavering affection. Yet beneath this appearance of security lay a deep and inescapable danger, the danger that hung over every royal mistress, for her whole position rested upon the existence of one aging man, and when that life should end, as end it must before many years, her splendour would end with it. This was the shadow that lay across all her glittering good fortune, the knowledge that she held everything by a single thread, and that the thread was the life of a king who was no longer young, and whose health, though still robust, could not last forever. The Comtesse du Barry was bound to the king as a climbing plant is bound to the tree that supports it, and his death would mean her fall, her exile from the splendour she had known, the loss of everything but the jewels and the treasure she had been prudent enough to gather. She knew this, as everyone at court knew it, and the knowledge must have cast its shadow even over the brightest of her days, for she lived always in the consciousness that her happiness was held on lease, terminable at any moment, by the loss of the man she served. That moment, when it came suddenly, and it is to the king's last illness, and to the sudden ending of all her glory, that we now turn. The blow fell in the spring of the year 1774, suddenly and without warning, and it transformed the Comtesse du Barry's whole existence in the space of a few short days. The king, who had seemed in robust health for one of his age, was taken ill at Versailles, and the illness, which at first was not understood, soon revealed itself as the most dreaded of all the diseases of the age, the smallpox. It was a terrible affliction, disfiguring and often fatal, and in a man of the king's years it was likely to prove mortal, as those around him quickly understood. The King of France lay dying, and the whole court and the entire kingdom held its breath to see whether he would recover or whether the lengthy reign was at last drawing to its close. For the Comtesse du Barry, the king's illness was a catastrophe of the most personal and immediate kind, for her entire position, her whole splendour, her entire future hung upon his days, and now that life was in the gravest danger, she did not, to her great credit, flee from the danger of the contagion, but stayed near the king through the first days of his illness, nursing him and comforting him with the devotion of one who genuinely loved him, careless of the risk to herself. Whatever else might be said of her, She did not abandon the dying king in his extremity, and her conduct in those first hours when the outcome was still uncertain showed a courage and a loyalty that her enemies would never have credited her with. But as the king's condition worsened and it became clear that he was dying, a terrible necessity began to make itself felt, a necessity rooted in the religion of the age and in the king's own tormented conscience. For a dying man, in that age of faith, had to make his peace with God, to confess his sins and receive the last rites of the church, and the king could not be absolved while he persisted in the mortal sin of keeping a mistress at his side. The presence of the Comtesse du Barry, the living symbol of the king's long career of adultery, stood between the dying monarch and the salvation of his soul, and the priests who attended him, and the pious members of his family, made it plain that, before he could be shriven and prepared for death, the favourite must be sent away. So the cruel logic of the deathbed asserted itself, and it was determined that the Comtesse du Barry must leave the king, must be removed from Versailles, so that the dying monarch might make his peace with God. It was a bitter necessity, for it meant the parting of two people who had been the comfort of each other's lives, and it meant, for the favourite, the first stroke of the ruin that the king's death would complete. She had nursed him and comforted him. She had stayed by him in his danger, and now she was to be sent away from his bedside, so that he might die in the odour of sanctity, abandoned at the very moment of his greatest need by the cruel requirements of religion and state. The parting, when it came, was a scene of real pathos, and it marked the end of the Comtesse du Barry's glory. To that parting we now turn. The parting of the king and his mistress was managed quietly, in the way that such painful necessities were managed at court, and it brought to an end, in a few sorrowful moments, the 5 years of splendour that had transformed the seamstress's daughter into the most envied woman in France. The king, conscious of what had to be done, and perhaps half relieved to have the burden of his conscience eased, agreed that the Comtesse du Barry must go, and she was told that she must leave Versailles. There was a last meeting, a final parting between the dying monarch and the woman who had been the comfort of his last years, and then she was taken away from the palace that had been the scene of her glory, sent off quietly to a place of retirement while the king was prepared for death. It is said that the king, in his last lucid days, spoke of her with tenderness and concern, and that he sent word she was to be cared for and provided for, that the debts she had incurred in his service were to be honoured, that no harm was to come to her through any fault of his, that even as he made his peace with God and renounced the sins of his past, he did not forget the woman who had cherished him, and that he gave instructions for her to be cared for and protected. Whatever the truth of these reports, it is certain that the parting was a grief to both of them, for theirs had been a genuine attachment, and the king's passing would leave the Comtesse du Barry not only ruined but bereaved, robbed of the man who had raised her up, and who had been, in his strange way, the love of her existence. She left Versailles in sorrow and in fear, knowing that with the king's death her whole world would come crashing down. She was taken to a place of retirement, and there she waited, in suspense and dread, for the news that all France was waiting for, the news of the king's death. The days passed, the king sank lower, and the Comtesse du Barry, removed from his side, could only wait and grieve and contemplate the ruin that was rushing upon her. The man who had been the source and the guarantee of all her splendour was dying, and with his last breath would die everything she had, her position, her wealth, her security, her place in society. She had climbed so impossibly high, from the gutter to the summit, and now she was to be cast down again, and she could only wait, helpless, for the blow to fall. And then, on the 10th of May in the year 1774, the long reign came to its end, and the king died at Versailles, his sufferings over at last. The candle that was placed in the window of the king's chamber, the signal that the monarch was dead, was extinguished, and the courtiers rushed away to pay their court to the new king, the youthful Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette. The old reign was over, and with it was over the splendour of the Comtesse du Barry, for the woman who had ruled the heart of Louis XV was now nothing, a fallen favourite without a protector, exposed to the malice of all her foes and to the disfavour of the new sovereigns. Her fall had begun, and it would carry her, in the first instance, into exile and disgrace. To that exile we now turn. With the old king cold upon his bed, the Comtesse du Barry's ruin was complete, for the protection that had shielded her was gone, and there was no one now to stand between her and the malice of all those she had outshone. The court that had fawned upon her the week before turned its back without a qualm, and she found herself, in the space of a few days, transformed from the most envied woman in France into a disgraced and friendless outcast, with nothing left of her splendour but the treasure she had been wise enough to gather, and the memories of all that she had lost. The first act of the new reign, so far as the Comtesse du Barry was concerned, was her banishment, for it was decided that she should be removed from the neighbourhood of the court and confined, at least for a time, in a place of retirement and penance. She was sent to a convent, the Abbey of Pont-aux-Dames, some distance from Paris, and there she was to live in seclusion, cut off from the court she had known, doing penance, as it were, for the scandal of her life. It was a humiliating reversal for the woman who had lately been the most envied in France, to be shut away in a convent like a disgraced girl, stripped of her position and her influence, banished from the brilliant world in which she had shone. Yet the Comtesse du Barry bore this reversal, as she bore all the trials of her existence, with a sweetness and a resignation that did her credit, and she made, by all accounts, an unexpectedly good impression upon the nuns who received her. They had expected, no doubt, a vulgar and arrogant woman, hardened by vice and corrupted by power, and they found instead a gentle, good-natured creature, courteous and obliging and without airs, who adapted herself to the quiet life of the convent with a grace that won their affection. Even in her fall, the charm and the sweetness that had always been her chief gifts did not desert her, and she made friends among the very folk who might have been expected to despise her. Her time at Pont-aux-Dames, though a humiliation, or the simple harsh imprisonment it might have been, for her gentle disposition softened the hearts of those around her. The banishment, in any case, did not last forever, for the Comtesse du Barry was no real danger to anyone, and the harshness of the new reign toward her gradually relaxed. After some months of confinement at the convent, she was permitted greater freedom, and in time she was allowed to leave Pont-aux-Dames altogether and to return to the home she loved best in all society, her beloved pavilion of Louveciennes. The fierce hatred that had pursued her in the days of her favour had cooled now that she was brought low and harmless, and she was suffered to retire into a private life, to live quietly upon the fortune she had gathered, away from the court and the world that had made and unmade her. A new chapter of her existence was beginning, quieter and in some ways happier than the splendour that had gone before, and it is to that chapter, her time at Louveciennes after her fall, that we now turned. The return to Louveciennes opened what was, in many ways, the happiest and most peaceful period of the Comtesse du Barry's whole life, for freed from the strain and the hostility of the court, she could live at last in the quiet enjoyment of the things she loved. She was no longer the most envied woman in France, no longer the centre of intrigue and malice, no longer the target of the savage libels that had blackened her name, but simply a wealthy woman of leisure, retired to a beautiful country house, free to spend her days as she pleased. The fall that had seemed at the king's death, like the ruin of her existence, turned out to be the gateway to a gentler and a calmer existence. and she found at Louviers a contentment that the glittering years of her favour had never given her. She had kept from her days of splendour a fortune ample enough to maintain her in comfort and even in luxury, for the monarch's generosity had been boundless, and she had been prudent enough to gather what she could, above all, in the form of her famous jewels. She was able, therefore, to live at Louviers in a style of gracious ease, keeping her household and her carriages, entertaining her friends, indulging her love of beautiful things, presiding over her lovely pavilion and her gardens above the Seine. It was the existence of a wealthy and cultivated woman, refined and comfortable and serene, and it suited her far better than the feverish brilliance of the court had ever done. What pleased her most in these years was the simple freedom of them, the release from the perpetual watching and weighing that had worn upon her at court. At Versailles every word had been a move in some game she had never wished to play, but at Louviers she could speak and laugh as she pleased, walk in her gardens, sit late at supper with the few she trusted, and answer to no one. Her enemies had fallen silent, now that she was no longer a power to be feared, and the malice that had pursued her through the years of her favour died away into indifference, leaving her, for the first time in her adult life, simply to be happy. She devoted herself, too, to the improvement and the enjoyment of her estate, to her gardens and her grounds, to the care of the place she loved, planting and building and arranging, taking a quiet delight in the slow work of making a place beautiful, and finding in it a contentment that the feverish splendour of Versailles had never offered her, and she became, in the neighbourhood, a figure of kindness and charity, generous to the poor of the district, and beloved by those around her. The time at Louviers was a season of quiet happiness. The autumn of her existence lived in gracious retirement, and had the court remained as it was, she might have ended her days in peace, an old woman dreaming over the memories of her astonishing rise and fall. But the world was not to remain as it was, for great changes were gathering that would sweep away the whole order of things in which she had lived, and the peace of Louviers was only a lull before the final storm. Before that storm broke, however, there came into her quiet retreat a last and gentle happiness, a love that brightened her later years, and it is to that love, and to the man who brought it, that we now turn. Into the peaceful days of her retirement at Louviers there came a last and unexpected happiness, an affection that brightened the autumn of the Comtesse du Barry's days, and gave her, perhaps for the first time, an attachment of her own free choosing. The man who brought her this happiness was Louis Hercule Timoleon de Cossé, Duc de Brissac, a great nobleman of ancient family, a man of high character and distinguished bearing, who fell deeply for the fallen favourite, and became, in those quiet years, the companion and the love of her later life. It was an attachment very different from the one she had known with the old king, for Brissac cherished her for herself, freely and devotedly, and she returned his devotion with a depth of feeling that suggests she had found at last a happiness that was truly her own. The Duc de Brissac was everything that her early protectors had not been, a man of honour and refinement and true nobility of soul, who treated her with a tenderness and a respect that she had rarely known. He was married, and the connection could not be a public or a regular one, but it was, by all accounts, a true and devoted attachment, the deepest and the most genuine attachment of her time. In his company she found a happiness and a contentment that crowned the gentle close of her retirement, and those who saw them together spoke of an ease and a tenderness between them that had nothing of the court about it, but that seemed rather the deep affection of two people who had found, late in life, exactly what they needed in each other, and the two of them, the fallen favourite and the great nobleman, lived out a quiet idyll at Louviers, surrounded by beauty and friendship, sheltered from the storms of the age in the lovely retreat above the Seine. For a time this gentle happiness continued undisturbed, and the Comtesse du Barry, in the company of the man she loved, enjoyed a serenity that the feverish brilliance of her youth had never offered. She was no longer young, and the bloom of her famous beauty was fading, but she had something better than the admiration of a court, the steady devotion of a good man, and she had learned, in her quiet retirement, to value the gentler pleasures of friendship and beauty and peace above the glittering vanities of her former life. Had the world stood still, she might have grown old in this contentment, dreaming over her memories with the man she cherished beside her, and ended her days in the peace of Louveciennes. But society was not standing still, for in this very season the great storm was gathering that would tear down the whole order of things in which the Comtesse du Barry had lived and risen and fallen. The old monarchy of France, the world of Versailles and the court and the privileged nobility, was approaching its end, undermined by debt and discontent, and the rising anger of a people who would no longer endure the injustices of the old order. The revolution was coming, and when it came it would sweep away the Comtesse du Barry along with the whole world to which she belonged, and would turn her gentle idol at Louveciennes into the prelude to a tragedy. Before we follow her into that darkness, let us look at the happy years of her retirement, the calm before the storm, for they were the last good years she would know. In the years of her retirement, the Comtesse du Barry became, in her own neighbourhood, a figure of a very different kind from the scandalous favourite of the libels, for to the people of the district around Louveciennes she was known as a generous and kindly lady, charitable to the poor and beloved by those around her. She had not forgotten the poverty of her own beginnings, and she had the open hand and the warm heart of one who could not bear to see want in others, and she gave freely to the needy of the neighbourhood, relieving distress, helping the unfortunate, earning the gratitude and the affection of the common folk among whom she now lived. The seamstress's daughter, raised to the summit of the court and cast down again, had become a benevolent country lady, and there were many in the district who had cause to bless her name. And her days were filled with the gentle occupations of a wealthy woman of leisure, with the care of her house and her gardens, the society of her friends, the enjoyment of the beautiful things she had gathered. She took great pleasure in her grounds, in the improvement and the adornment of her beloved Louveciennes, and she presided over her household with the easy kindliness that had always made her servants devoted to her. The pavilion that Ledoux had built for her, the lovely garden house above the Seine, remained the jewel of her estate, the setting of her happiest hours, and she filled it and her chateau with the fine furniture and the beautiful objects that her taste delighted in, living among loveliness as she had always loved to do. It was in these years, too, that she sat for the young painter who would leave the most sympathetic record of her later life, a portrait of a woman faded from her famous beauty, but gentle and unaffected still. Viggy Lebrun found her not the hardened adventuress of legend, but a kindly, simple, good-natured woman, faded a little from the famous beauty of her youth, but still attractive, easy and natural in her manner, without affectation or arrogance, living quietly among her friends and her beautiful possessions. It was a portrait that did much to correct the cruel caricature of the libels, and it preserved for posterity the image of the Comtesse du Barry as she was in the calm autumn of her life. These were good times, perhaps the best of her career, for she had peace and security and the love of a good man. She had beauty around her and friends about her, and the gratitude of the poor she helped. And she had laid aside the strain and the danger of her time at court. She was no longer young, and her great days were behind her, but she had found, in her quiet retirement, a contentment that her glittering youth had never given her, and she might have been forgiven for thinking that the storms of her time were over and that nothing remained but to grow old in peace. But the storms were not over. The greatest storm of all was gathering, and it would break upon her with a fury that would sweep away her peace, her happiness, her fortune, and at last her existence itself. To the gathering of that storm, the coming of the revolution, we now turn. The revolution that broke upon France in the year 1789 was the greatest upheaval that the country had ever known, a vast convulsion that would tear down the throne, the great families, an entire framework of privilege beneath which France had groaned for so long. The causes of it ran deep, in the debts and the injustices and the discontents that had been accumulating for generations, and when the dam at last gave way, the flood was overwhelming. The whole structure of the old society, with its monarchy and its nobles and its vast inequalities, was doomed, and all who had lived by it were swept up in the ruin, the Comtesse du Barry among them. For the first phase of the revolution, the Comtesse du Barry was able to live on at Louveciennes much as before, for the early stages of the upheaval did not immediately threaten her, and she continued her quiet life of retirement in the lovely retreat above the Seine. But the danger was real and growing, for she was of all folk the very symbol of the old corrupt order that the revolution had risen to destroy, the low-born favourite who had embodied the extravagance and the vice of the monarchy. For a time she tried nonetheless to make her peace with the new order, giving generously to the poor of her district, and hoping that her kindness and her harmlessness would shield her from the gathering storm, and the folk of Louveciennes, who knew her charity, were for the most part well disposed toward her. In those first years it seemed she might be left to live on quietly, an old relic of a vanished world whom no one troubled to pursue. But the revolution was not to be bought off with charity, and the very wealth that allowed her to be generous would mark her out, in the end, as an enemy of the people, and as the revolution grew more radical and more violent, the association became more and more perilous. The libels that had blackened her name in the period of her favour had done their work, and to the revolutionaries she was a figure of hatred, a relic of the despised regime, marked out for destruction. She was, moreover, immensely rich, or so it was believed, and her wealth, like her past, made her a target, for the revolution was hungry for the property of the old order, and the famous jewels and treasures of the Comtesse du Barry were a prize that the new masters of France would not overlook. Her connection with the fallen nobility, her past as the king's mistress, her reputation for fabulous wealth, all marked her out for the attention of the revolutionary authorities, and as the time passed, and the revolution turned ever more savage, the net began, slowly, to close around her. The peace of Louveciennes was no longer secure, and the storm that was tearing France apart was drawing nearer to her door. Ni trop. Yet the Comtesse du Barry, with the heedlessness that had always been part of her nature, did not flee while there was still time, did not seek safety abroad, as so many of the old nobility were doing, but clung to her beloved Louveciennes, and to the man she loved, unwilling to abandon the spot and the existence that had given her such happiness. Many of those connected with the old court fled the country in this period, escaping across the borders to wait out the storm in exile, and had the Comtesse du Barry done the same she might have saved her life. But she stayed, drawn by her love of Louveciennes and by her attachment to the Duc de Brissac, gambling that the storm would pass her by, and the gamble would cost her everything. The first blow that fell upon her, however, came not from the politics of the revolution, but from common crime, in the theft of her famous jewels, and it was this robbery that would, by a cruel irony, help to seal her fate. To that robbery we now turn. In 1791, the Comtesse du Barry suffered a blow that would, by a strange and fatal chain of consequences, help to lead her to the scaffold, for in that year her famous diamonds, the treasure she had gathered through all her days of favour, were stolen from Louveciennes in a daring robbery. The thieves made off with a fortune in diamonds and precious stones, the accumulated splendour of her years at court, and the loss was a grievous one, for the stones were not only of immense value, but were, in a sense, the very foundation of her security, the treasure she had laid up against misfortune. The Comtesse du Barry was determined to recover them, and she set in motion the efforts to track down the thieves and reclaim her property that would, all unknowing, draw the noose about her own neck. The pursuit of the stolen jewels led her across the Channel to England, for the thieves and the diamonds had made their way to London, and the Comtesse du Barry travelled to England, more than once, to press her claims and to seek the recovery of her treasure through the English courts. These journeys to London were, in the circumstances of the time, an act of the gravest danger, for France was in the grip of the Revolution, and the watchful eyes of the revolutionary authorities marked the comings and goings of the old nobility with deep suspicion. A former favourite of the king, travelling repeatedly to England, the refuge of the émigré nobility, the home of the enemies of the Revolution, was bound to attract attention, and every journey deepened the suspicion that attached to her. For in London the Comtesse du Barry moved among the émigrés, the French nobles who had fled the Revolution and gathered in exile, the very people whom the revolutionary government regarded as its deadliest enemies. Whether or not she had any part in their schemes, her association with them was enough to mark her as a suspect, and her repeated journeys to and from England were noted and remembered, and would later be used against her. The pursuit of her stolen jewels, undertaken to recover her property and secure her future, became instead the evidence of her supposed treason, the proof, in the eyes of the revolutionary tribunal, that she was an enemy of the revolution conspiring with the émigrés abroad. The theft that had robbed her of her treasure would, in the end, rob her of her time. She could not have known, as she pressed her claims and made her crossings, that she was gathering the very materials of her own destruction, and that the diamonds she pursued so determinedly would draw her, by their long and tangled trail, toward the scaffold. Before we follow the final catastrophe, it is worth looking more closely at those fateful journeys to England, for they were the thread that the terror would seize upon to destroy her. To those journeys, and the danger they carried, we now turn. The journeys that the Comtesse du Barry made to England in pursuit of her stolen diamonds deserve a closer look, for the details of them reveal both her courage and the depth of the trap into which she was walking. She crossed the Channel several times in the early years of the Revolution, an arduous undertaking for a woman past her 50th year, lodging in London, while the English courts heard the case of her recovered treasure and the slow processes of the law ground on. She was seen in the drawing-rooms of the English capital, a celebrated figure from the vanished court of Versailles, received with curiosity by a society that found her past romantic and her manner charming, and for a while she moved in that foreign city as a kind of exotic relic of a world that had already begun to pass into legend. Whatever the innocence of her purpose, the company she kept in London was her undoing, for the English capital had filled with the émigrés, the noble exiles who plotted there for the overthrow of the Revolution, and these were her natural companions, the people of her own lost world. She dined with them, she was seen among them, she shared, no doubt, their grief for the France that was gone, and their hatred of the men who had destroyed it, and every such meeting was a thread in the net that her enemies were weaving. There were agents of the Revolution in London too, watching the émigrés and noting who came and went, and the comings and goings of the famous Comtesse du Barry did not escape them. When she returned to France for the last time, drawn back by her fatal love of Louveciennes, she carried with her, all unknowing, the materials of the case that would destroy her. For there was a further charge that hung about her London journeys, the suspicion that she had carried wealth out of France to place it beyond the reach of the Revolution, and worse, that she had lent that wealth to the émigré cause. Whether she had truly done so can never be known with certainty, for the evidence is tangled, and much of it was manufactured by men who wanted her dead. But it is likely enough that she had helped her exiled friends in their need, for she had never in her life been able to refuse those who appealed to her. Her generosity, which had always been among the truest of her virtues, was turned in the end into the proof of her treason, and the open hand that had relieved so much distress was made the instrument of her ruin. So the long trail of the stolen diamonds, which had drawn her across the sea and into the company of the doomed nobility, led her back at last to France, and to the shadow of the scaffold. She had crossed the channel to recover a treasure, and she had found instead the evidence that would condemn her, and the journeys undertaken in hope became, in the hands of her accusers, the record of her guilt. It was the cruel and characteristic logic of those days, which took the innocent acts of those it had marked and wove them into a rope, and the Comtesse du Barry, returning to her beloved Louveciennes, had sealed her fate without knowing it. Before the blow fell upon her directly, however, it fell upon the man she loved, for the revolution was turning to blood, and the Duc de Brissac was among the first of its victims. To the descent of the Terror and the death of Brissac we now turn. As the revolution advanced, it grew steadily more radical and more violent, until at last it passed into the phase that history remembers as the Terror, a period in which the revolutionary government, gripped by fear and fury, turned upon its enemies, real and imagined, and sent them to the guillotine in their thousands. The monarchy had fallen, the king himself had been tried and beheaded, and the queen, Marie Antoinette, the proud Austrian princess who had once refused to speak to the Comtesse du Barry, was imprisoned and would follow her husband to the scaffold. The whole world of the old order was being torn down in blood, and those who had belonged to it, the nobles and the courtiers and all who were marked by their connection with the fallen regime, lived now in daily peril of their lives. The machinery of the Terror was the Revolutionary Tribunal, a court established to try the enemies of the revolution, and it worked with a speed and a ruthlessness that made it an instrument of wholesale death. Accusation was nearly as good as conviction. The forms of justice were observed only barely, if at all, and those brought before the tribunal had little hope of escape, for the times demanded victims and the tribunal supplied them. To be denounced as an enemy of the revolution, as an aristocrat, as a friend of the old order, as a suspect of any kind, was to stand in the gravest danger, and the prisons of Paris filled with men and women awaiting their turn before the judges and the blade. In this atmosphere of suspicion and death, the Comtesse du Barry was a marked woman, for everything about her made her an object of revolutionary hatred. She was the very symbol of the old corrupt court, the low-born favourite who had embodied its vices, the mistress of a king, the possessor of fabulous wealth, and the friend, it was whispered, of the émigré enemies of the revolution. Her journeys to London, undertaken to recover her stolen jewels, were remembered and held against her, twisted into evidence of treasonous dealings with the enemies of France abroad. The net that had been closing slowly around her for a long time now drew tight, and it was only a matter of time before the Terror reached out its hand to take her. Yet still she did not flee, though the danger was now plain and the example of others should have warned her, for she clung to Louveciennes and to her life there with a fatal attachment, unwilling to abandon her home and unable, perhaps, to believe that the storm would truly engulf her. She had survived so much, the malice of the court, the death of the king, the disgrace of her banishment, and perhaps she trusted that she would survive this too, that her harmlessness and her good temperament would shield her, that the revolution would have no quarrel with a woman who wished no one ill. It was a fatal miscalculation, for the Terror did not spare the harmless, and the gentle disposition that had been her charm was no protection against the blind fury of the age. The first blow, when it came, struck not at her directly, but at the man she loved, and it is to the death of the Duc de Brissac that we now, with heavy hearts, must turn. The Duc de Brissac, the man who had brought the Comtesse du Barry the last and gentlest happiness of her life, was among the early victims of the Revolution's turn to violence, for he was a great nobleman, a commander of the King's Guard, marked out for destruction by his rank and his loyalty to the fallen monarchy. In the year 1792, as the Revolution descended into the first of its great paroxysms of bloodshed, Brissac was arrested and imprisoned, caught up in the savage suspicion of the time, and he was being moved under guard with a group of other prisoners when the violence overtook him. A mob fell upon the prisoners, and the Duc de Brissac was killed, struck down in the brutal manner of those terrible days. His existence ended by the blind fury of the Revolution. He had not been able to escape. The manner of his passing was made the more dreadful by an act of savage cruelty, for it is said that his murderers, knowing of his attachment to the Comtesse du Barry, carried his severed head to Louvetiennes and threw it over the wall into the grounds of her beloved retreat, so that the woman who had loved him should be confronted with this ghastly token of his fate. Whether the story is true in every particular hardly matters, for it captures the horror of the time and the special cruelty that the Revolution reserved for those it hated, and it brought to the Comtesse du Barry the most terrible grief of her career. The man she had cherished, the companion of her peaceful years, the last happiness of her existence, was gone, murdered by the Revolution, and his end was a foretaste of the fate that awaited her. The loss of Brissac was a blow from which the Comtesse du Barry never recovered, for he had been the centre of her later life, the love that had crowned her quiet retirement, and his death left her alone and bereaved in a world that was growing daily more dangerous. The peace and the happiness of Louvetiennes were shattered, the gentle idyll of her later years brought to a brutal end, and she faced the gathering storm now without the comfort and the support of the man she had loved. Her grief was deep and genuine, for whatever else might be said of her, she had loved Brissac truly, and as his murder was the cruelest stroke that fate had yet dealt her. And the loss of Brissac was, in its way, a warning, a sign of the fury that was abroad in France, and of the fate that awaited those connected with the old order. If a great nobleman like Brissac could be torn to pieces by a mob, then no one of his world was safe, least of all the Comtesse du Barry, who carried upon her the double mark of the king's favourite and the suspected friend of the émigrés. The shadow of the guillotine was falling across her now, and the time of her own reckoning was drawing near. She had lost her beloved, she had lost her jewels, she was losing, day by day, the security of her quiet life, and soon she would lose her liberty, and then her time. The hand of the Revolution was reaching out for her at last, and it is to her arrest, the beginning of the end, that we now turn. The arrest of the Comtesse du Barry came in the autumn of the year 1793, when the Revolution was at its bloodiest, and the guillotine was claiming its victims by the score, and it was brought about in part by denunciation, for in those days of suspicion and fear, there were always those ready to inform against their neighbours, whether from conviction or malice or the hope of reward. The Comtesse du Barry had enemies still, and she had a household and a circle of acquaintance among whom there were those who would betray her, and in the poisoned atmosphere of the Terror a denunciation was easily made and rarely doubted. She was accused of the crimes that the times reserved for those of her kind, of being an enemy of the Revolution, of conspiring with the émigrés, of wasting upon herself the wealth that belonged to the nation. What gave the denunciation its weight was the testimony of those who had served her and now turned against her, for in the poisoned atmosphere of the Terror, a frightened servant or a resentful dependent could buy a measure of safety by informing on a master. A man who had been close to her household, and who knew the comings and goings of Louvetiennes, laid information against her, and his words, however coloured by fear or spite, were taken as the gospel of her guilt. So the woman who had been so careless of malice all her days, who had forgiven so freely and bound so many to her by kindness, was undone at the last by the betrayal of those she had trusted. She was taken from Louveciennes, the beloved retreat that had been the home of her heart, and carried off to imprisonment in Paris, lodged at last in the grim prison of the Conciergerie, the antechamber of the guillotine, where the condemned awaited their turn before the blade. The woman who had once commanded the favour of a king was now a prisoner of the Revolution, shut up in a cell to await her trial, and the long, strange journey of her years had brought her to this narrow and comfortless room from which she must have known there was little chance of any escape but one. The wheel had come full circle, and the seamstress's daughter, after all her astonishing rise and her gentle decline, faced the final and the most terrible reversal of her extraordinary life. In prison, the Comtesse du Barry did not meet her fate with the proud composure that some of the condemned displayed, for she was not a woman of heroic temper, and she clung to life with all the desperate longing of one who loved the world and was not ready to leave it. She had always been a creature of warmth and pleasure, in love with beauty and ease and the simple joys of living, and she could not face the prospect of death with the cold disdain that the aristocratic code demanded. She hoped, she pleaded, she sought by every means to save herself, to delay the inexorable approach of the blade, and her terror and her clinging to life would mark her last days and her last moments with a peculiar and very human pathos. But first she had to face her accusers, and it is to her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal that we now turn. The trial of the Comtesse du Barry before the Revolutionary Tribunal was, like so many of the trials of that terrible time, less a genuine inquiry into guilt than a formality preceding a death that had already been decided upon. The tribunal was an instrument of the terror, and those who came before it had little hope of acquittal, for the times demanded victims and the judges supplied them, and the Comtesse du Barry, with her notorious past and the charges heaped upon her, was condemned almost before her trial began. Yet the forms were gone through, the accusations were read, the witnesses were heard, and the woman who had once enchanted a king stood before the revolutionary judges to answer for the crime of having been what she was. The charges against her were the familiar charges of the terror, that she was an enemy of the revolution, that she had conspired with the emigres abroad, that she had carried her treasure to England to aid the enemies of France, that she had wasted upon her own corrupt pleasures the wealth that belonged to the nation. Her past as the king's favourite was held up as the mark of her guilt, and the whole squalid apparatus of revolutionary justice was brought to bear upon a woman whose real offence was simply that she had belonged to the old order and was believed to be rich. The evidence was weak and the proceedings were a mockery, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Comtesse du Barry, for her part, did not face her judges with defiance or with dignity, but fought for her life with all the desperate ingenuity of one who could not bear to die. She denied the charges, she protested her innocence, she sought to explain away the journeys to London and to account for her wealth, and above all, in a final desperate gambit, she offered to buy her time by revealing the hiding places of her treasures, the jewels and the valuables she had concealed against the evil day. She poured out the locations of her hidden hoards, hoping that her usefulness as a source of wealth for the revolution might persuade her judges to spare her, but the revelation, far from saving her, served only to confirm the charge that she had concealed the nation's treasure, and it did her no good at all. She fought, in short, with every weapon left to a woman in her position, and her refusal to go quietly to her fate, though it has been counted against her as weakness, was at least the honest measure of how much she loved the life that was being torn from her. The verdict, in any case, was the verdict of the terror. She was condemned to death, and she was to die the next day. To her last hours passed among the condemned in the prisons of the Revolution, we now turn. The last weeks of the Comtesse du Barry's life were passed in the prisons of the Revolution, in the grim and crowded cells where the condemned of the terror waited for their turn before the tribunal and the blade. It was a strange and terrible society that gathered in those prisons, for the terror swept up its victims from every rank and condition, and the cells held together the great and the humble, the noble and the common, all levelled now by the shadow of the guillotine that hung over them all. Here were dukes and duchesses who had once dwelt in palaces, priests and merchants and ordinary folk, the famous and the obscure, all crowded together in the same wretched confinement, all waiting for the same fate. In this company the Comtesse du Barry passed her final days, and the strange society of the prison left a deep impression on those who shared it with her. Old enmities were forgotten there, for the shadow of the blade fell alike on all, and people who would never have spoken in the world outside now sat together through the long hours, sharing what little they had and waiting. Into this grim fellowship the Comtesse du Barry was received, and she met it, as she met everything in her life, with more of the heart than of the head. The other prisoners watched her with a mixture of pity and unease, for her open fear was hard to witness, and it broke the fragile composure that the condemned tried to keep about them. Some among the old nobility, schooled in the aristocratic code, thought her conduct unworthy, a disgrace to those who were to die alongside her, and they drew apart from her in cold disapproval. But others, gentler or more honest, were moved by the very rawness of her grief, and could not find it in their hearts to blame a woman who only wished, with her whole soul, to go on living. So she passed her final days in the crowded prison, hoping against hope, watching the carts carry off their loads of the condemned, and knowing that her own turn was coming. She made what efforts she could to save herself, clinging to every rumour of delay, and every faint chance of reprieve. But the machinery of the terror ground on, indifferent to her pleading, and the day of her trial drew steadily nearer. To that trial, and to the scaffold that waited beyond it, we now finally turn. On the 8th of December in the year 1793, the Comtesse du Barry was taken from her prison to the place of execution, to die upon the guillotine in a public square of Paris, as so many had died before her, and so many would die after. The woman who had been the last love of Louis XV, who had risen from a seamstress's cottage to the summit of Versailles, who had been dressed in diamonds and lodged in palaces and envied by all of France, was carried through the streets in the cart of the condemned to meet her end before a watching crowd. The wheel of her astonishing life had come to its final turn, and the seamstress's daughter, after all her glory and all her grief, was to perish on the scaffold like a common enemy of the Revolution. What the watching crowd saw that morning was not the icy disdain that the great folk wore to the blade, but something rawer and more ordinary. She had no high birth to live up to, and no code of pride to carry her through, only a warm heart that loved the plain sweetness of being alive, and the nearness of the end overwhelmed her, so that she went to it weeping and entreating, in a manner the onlookers never forgot. Where others walked to the blade with a fine disdain, masking their fear behind the aristocratic code, the Comtesse du Barry wept and pleaded and begged for her career, clinging to the world with a desperate and very human longing. Her cries for mercy, her pitiful entreaties for a little more time, rang out where the calm last words of others had been spoken, and the crowd that had come to watch her die heard not defiance, but the raw and naked fear of a woman who did not want to die. It is recorded that at the very end, upon the scaffold itself, she pleaded with her executioner for a moment's respite, crying out for one more moment, a little moment more. in a last desperate effort to put off the inevitable. The plea was in vain, as such pleas always were, and the sentence of the tribunal was carried out, and the Comtesse du Barry was beheaded, her extraordinary career brought to its end by the blade of the guillotine. So perished the seamstress's daughter, who had captivated a king, dying in terror and grief in her 50th year, a victim of the revolution that had swept away the whole world to which she had belonged. Her terror at the end, her undignified clinging to life, has been remembered and remarked upon ever since, and it has been read in different ways, as cowardice by some, as mere human weakness by others. But there is something to be said for the view that her very lack of heroic composure was the most honest thing about her end, for she made no pretence of a courage she did not feel, no display of a disdain for the world that she could not honestly have claimed. She loved life simply and wholeheartedly, as she had always loved beauty and pleasure and the warm joys of society, and her desperate struggle against death was the natural and unfeigned cry of a creature who wished only to go on living. There was no nobility in it, perhaps, but there was a kind of truth, and her end, for all its lack of dignity, was of a piece with all that had gone before, the passing of a warm and simple and pleasure-loving woman who had never been anything but herself. Her death had a strange echo, moreover, in the death of another woman, the Queen who had once scorned her, and who had gone to the same scaffold only weeks before, and it is to that haunting symmetry, and to the meaning of it, that we now turn. There is a strange and a haunting symmetry in the fate of the Comtesse du Barry and the fate of the woman who had once refused to speak to her, for Marie Antoinette, the proud Austrian princess who had become Queen of France, perished upon the same scaffold and by the same blade, only a few weeks before the favourite she had despised. The two women so different in birth and in temper, the one risen from the gutter and the other born to the purple, had been linked in life by their famous feud, and they were linked at the last by their common end, both swept away by the revolution, that made no distinction between the queen and the courtesan, but sent them alike to the guillotine. The contrast between the two women had been the talk of Europe in the days of their feud, the low-born favourite and the imperial princess, the one all warmth and good humour, and the other all pride and disdain, and the war of silence between them had seemed at the time a matter of the greatest consequence. Marie Antoinette had refused to soil herself by speaking to the king's mistress, had held herself aloof in the conscious dignity of her royal blood, and had yielded at last only the barest minimum of civility, a single grudging sentence about the crowd at Versailles. The gulf between the two women had seemed unbridgeable, fixed by birth and rank and the whole order of the world, and yet the revolution bridged it in the most terrible way, for it cared nothing for the distinctions that had divided them, and has sent the Queen and the favourite to the same fate within the same season. Marie Antoinette went to the scaffold in October of the year 1793, and she met her end with the proud composure of her race, dignified and unflinching to the last, true to the aristocratic code in which she had been bred. The Comtesse du Barry followed her in December, and she went to her end very differently, weeping and pleading and clinging to life, true to her own warm and simple disposition. The two women died as they had lived, the one in pride and the other in terror, but they perished alike, and the revolution made them, at the last, equal. There is a lesson in this symmetry, or at least a meaning, for it shows how the great convulsion of the revolution swept away all the distinctions of the old order, levelling the queen and the courtesan in a common ruin, making nothing of the gulfs of birth and rank that had seemed so absolute. The proud princess and the low-born favourite, who in life had been divided by everything, were united in death by the blind fury of the age, and their two fates, set side by side, tell the whole story of the fall of the old France, that dazzling and unjust and doomed world that raised them both and destroyed them both, In the Queen's proud death and the favourite's frightened one, the old order made its exit from the stage, and a new and terrible age began. With that thought, let us turn to gather up the meaning of the whole strange story we have followed tonight. What are we to make, in the end, of the life of the Comtesse du Barry, this woman who rose so impossibly high and fell so terribly low, whose name has come down to us wrapped in scandal and pity and a kind of dark fascination? She was not a great woman, in any of the usual senses, for she had no learning, and no political genius, no grand designs, and no lasting achievements of statecraft or of art. She did not shape the destiny of nations as her predecessor Pompadour had done, nor leave behind her any monument of policy or thought. She was, in the plainest terms, a beautiful woman who captivated a king, and who rode that beauty from the bottom of society to the very top, and then was swept away when the world that had raised her came crashing down. And yet her story holds us still, more than 2 centuries after her death, and there is more in it than the mere scandal of a favourite's rise and fall. For her existence touches at its 2 extremes the deepest contrasts of the age in which she lived, the dazzling splendour of the old monarchy at its height, and the savage fury of the revolution that destroyed it. She rose in the bright sunset of the Ancien Regime, when a king's favour could still lift a nobody to the summit of the earth, and she perished in the storm that swept that whole bright world away, caught between the 2 ages as between the closing jaws of a vice. Her life spans the whole arc of that great transformation, from the gilded court to the guillotine, and in her person the 2 worlds meet. There is, too, the human truth of her, the warm and simple and good-natured creature who shines through all the scandal and the slander, and who makes her, in the end, a sympathetic figure despite everything. She was no monster of vice, whatever the libels said, but a kindly, generous, pleasure-loving woman, who wished no one ill and did much good, who loved beauty and friendship and the simple joys of living, and who met her terrible end not with heroic pretension, but with the honest terror of one who loved life and did not want to die. There is a pathos in her story that the centuries have not dimmed, the pathos of a gentle creature caught between the cruelty of 2 ages, raised by the corruption of the one and destroyed by the fury of the other, guilty of nothing worse than being what her beauty and her poverty had made her. Perhaps that is the truest thing to say of her, that she was a creature of her age, formed by its injustices and destroyed by its convulsions, neither the wicked adventuress of legend nor any kind of heroine, but simply a woman, with a woman's warmth and weakness, swept up by forces far beyond her understanding or control. She has been judged harshly by some and pitied by many, and both the judgment and the pity have their justice, but what lingers in the end is the image of the seamstress's daughter, who climbed the summit of the world on nothing but her loveliness and her charm, and who paid for that dizzy ascent with her time. Her story is one of the strangest and most affecting that the old France has left us, and it is time now to bring it, and our evening together, gently to a close. She left no great works behind her, no reforms, no writings, no monuments, save the lovely pavilion above the Seine, and yet her name has outlived those of statesmen and generals who thought themselves far greater than she, kept alive by the sheer drama of her rise and her fall, and by the strange tenderness that her story still calls forth in those who hear it. We have travelled a long way together tonight, following one woman across the whole strange span of her years, from her obscure beginning to her terrible end. We have watched her rise on nothing but her loveliness and her charm, climbing past every barrier that birth and rank set in her way, until she stood beside a king at the very heart of the most magnificent court in Europe. And we have watched that height crumble beneath her, and seen her carried down again into exile and grief and danger, and at the last into the hands of men who would not let her live, pleading with them for a little more of the world she had loved so well. Nut. And perhaps, lying there in the quiet, you have felt the strange double nature of her story, the way that so much beauty and so much sweetness should have ended in such terror and such grief, the way that the gentle, good-natured creature who wished no one ill should have been raised so high by one cruel age and destroyed so utterly by another. There is something in her, when the scandal is set aside, that asks for tenderness rather than judgment, the picture of an unguarded heart carried up by its own loveliness into a height it had never sought, and broken there by a violence it had done nothing to earn. It has been a quiet pleasure to wander through her life in your company, to follow her from the cottage to the court, and from the court to the end, and to try to see, behind the scandal and the slander, the genuine woman who lived and loved and suffered so very long ago. If these unhurried journeys into the lives of the past are a good way for you to ease the mind and let the day fall away, then you would be most welcome to come and travel with me again on the other evenings I have set down, and there are many more of them waiting whenever you should like them, other lives and other ages to disappear into for a while. You are welcome to follow along, so that these evenings can find their way back to you. And if there is some figure from the past you have always wondered about, someone whose story you would like us to wander through together, I would love for you to leave me a note about it, for I look through them with great pleasure, and many an evening like this one has begun with a quiet suggestion from someone listening in the dark. But that is for another night, and for now there is nothing left to do but to let the candles burn low and the long story fade, and to let the gentle Comtesse du Barry, with all her charm and all her sorrow, sink softly back into the past from which we called her up. You have travelled a long way tonight, all the way across the strange and glittering and terrible world of old France, and now it is time to set the journey down and let yourself drift the rest of the way into sleep. Let the palaces fade, and the diamonds, and the sound of my voice, and let the warm dark carry you gently down into rest. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.